Welcome, weary wanderer, to the twilight realm where legends are born and destinies unfold like ancient tapestries in the gentle evening breeze. Tonight, we shall follow the extraordinary journey of Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon, known simply as Ciri, through the vast and mystical world of The Witcher. This is a tale of bloodlines and prophecies, of love found and lost, of a young woman whose very existence would reshape the fabric of reality itself. So settle into your sanctuary of rest, let your breathing slow like the turning of seasons, and allow this story to carry you into peaceful slumber. There's no urgency here, no need to remember every twist of fate. Simply let the narrative flow over you like moonlight across still water. In the peaceful kingdom of Verdun, where rolling meadows stretched toward distant mountains, and the morning air carried the scent of apple blossoms and fresh bread from village ovens, Princess Ciri of Cintra found herself confronting the first great disappointment of her young life. She had been sent here with all the ceremony befitting her royal station, accompanied by guards whose armor gleamed in the sunlight and servants who attended to her every need. Yet the reality of her situation had proven far different from the romanticized notions that had filled her imagination during the long journey from her grandmother's court. The portrait of Prince Kistrin that had been presented to her months earlier had shown a young man of considerable handsomeness, with strong features and kind eyes that seemed to promise both strength and gentleness in equal measure. The artist had captured him in his finest clothes, standing beside a magnificent destrier with ribbons braided into its mane, the very picture of noble romantic idealism that filled the songs and stories Ciri had grown up hearing. Yet the reality that greeted her in Verdun's great hall was something altogether different and deeply disillusioning. Prince Kistrin bore only the faintest resemblance to his painted likeness, as if the artist had taken considerable liberties with both proportion and character, transforming an ordinary young man into something approaching the heroic ideal. His face was rounder than depicted, his eyes smaller and less expressive, while his manner carried none of the confident grace that the portrait had suggested. More troubling still was the obvious discomfort that marked every interaction between them, a mutual recognition that neither party possessed any genuine interest in the other. Kistrin's attention wandered constantly during their carefully supervised meetings, his gaze drifting toward the windows or settling upon one particular lady of the court whose beauty and vivacious personality had clearly captured his heart in ways that no arranged marriage could hope to match. Lady Alvina was everything that Ciri, in her innocence, had not yet learned to be. Where Ciri was direct and sometimes blunt in the manner of someone raised among warriors and courtiers who valued honesty over diplomacy, Alvina possessed the subtle arts of flirtation and conversation that could hold a young man's attention for hours. Her laughter was like music, her movements graceful as a dancer's, and her ability to make even the most mundane topics seem fascinating had clearly bewitched the prince who was supposed to be courting his young guest from Cintra. The awkwardness of the situation became more apparent with each passing day. Formal dinners where Ciri and Kistrin were seated together beside each other stretched into uncomfortable silences broken only by the most perfunctory exchanges about the weather or the quality of the harvest. Their supervised walks through the castle gardens felt more like diplomatic negotiations than romantic courtship, with both parties fulfilling their obligations without any genuine warmth or connection. It was during one such stilted conversation, as they sat beside a fountain whose gentle splashing provided the only pleasant sound in an otherwise tense atmosphere, that Ciri made her fateful decision. The princess, who had grown up hearing tales of adventure and heroism, who had spent her summers racing across the islands of Skellige and learning the ways of warriors and seafarers, found herself suddenly unable to endure another moment of this elaborate charade. The plan she conceived was simple in its audacity, and reflected both her noble upbringing and her complete inexperience with the harsh realities that lay beyond the protected walls of royal courts. She would simply leave, as easily as she might depart from any social gathering that had grown tedious, confident in her ability to make her own way in the world through a combination of royal privilege and youthful determination. Her chosen accomplice was Voimir's squire, a young man whose romantic notions about adventure and chivalry made him susceptible to the entreaties of a beautiful princess in distress. When Ciri approached him with her plan, describing herself as a captive of unwanted marriage who needed only a brave escort to guide her to freedom, his imagination filled with visions of the songs that would be sung about his gallant rescue of royal beauty from the bonds of loveless union. The squire's knowledge of the surrounding countryside was unfortunately far more limited than his enthusiasm for heroic gesture. When faced with the choice of routes that might carry them swiftly away from Verdun and toward whatever destination Ciri might choose, he selected what appeared to be the most direct path, without consideration for the dangers that might lie along it. Thus it was that their flight from the castle, which had begun with such optimism and excitement, led them directly toward the ancient forest of Brokilon, that vast wilderness which had remained unchanged since the earliest days of the world, and where the laws of human kingdoms held no sway whatsoever. The forest had a reputation that extended far beyond the borders of any single realm, spoken of in whispers by travelers and merchants who gave it the widest possible berth during their journeys. Brokilon was the domain of the Dryads, those ancient daughters of the forest who had made their compact with nature itself in ages past, and who guarded their territory with a fierce determination that brooked no intrusion from the outside world. The trees themselves seemed to watch those who approached their borders, their branches moving without wind, and their shadows falling in patterns that suggested intelligence and intent rather than mere natural growth. The warnings about Brokilon were not mere superstition or the exaggerated fears of nervous travelers. The forest's guardians maintained their isolation through methods both subtle and direct, turning away most intruders through confusion and misdirection, while dealing with more persistent trespassers through means that ensured they would never carry tales of what they had seen to the outside world. Yet the young squire's inexperience and romantic enthusiasm blinded him to the very real danger they were approaching. His mind was filled with visions of the gratitude that Princess Ciri would surely show him once they reached safety, and the fame that would be his when word spread of his daring rescue. The path through Brokilon appeared to offer the most direct route to destinations beyond Verdun's reach, and in his inexperience he saw only the practical advantages without recognizing the mortal peril. The first arrow took him before he had even realized they were no longer alone on the forest path. It flew from the shadows between the trees with the silence of death itself, finding its mark with the precision that spoke of a lifetime spent in perfect harmony with bow and forest. The young man who had dreamed of heroic adventure fell from his horse without a sound, his romantic notions extinguished in an instant by the harsh reality of forces beyond his understanding. Ciri's horse reared and bolted at the sudden violence, carrying her deeper into the forest while she struggled to maintain her seat and control the panic that threatened to overwhelm her completely. The sheltered princess, who had known only the safety of royal courts, suddenly found herself alone in a wilderness that seemed hostile to her very presence. Pursued by enemies she could not see, and guided by a mount whose terror might carry her into even greater danger. The forest itself seemed to close around her as her horse plunged through undergrowth and between massive tree trunks that had stood since before the first human kingdoms were founded. Ancient oaks and towering pines created a canopy so thick that the sunlight reached the forest floor only in scattered patches, while the air beneath the trees carried scents of moss and decay and growing things that spoke of cycles far older than human memory. It was in this green twilight between the mortal world and the realm of legend that Ciri encountered the creature that would have ended her story before it had properly begun. The Yigan was a thing of nightmare and shadow, a predator whose very existence defied the natural order as humans understood it. Its form shifted between shapes that the mind could barely comprehend, now appearing as a massive bear with too many limbs, now resembling some enormous insect whose carapace gleamed with an oily sheen that reflected the filtered sunlight in unnatural patterns. The monster's hunger was a thing that could be felt as well as seen, a spiritual void that sought to consume not merely flesh but the very essence of life itself. Its presence made the air itself seem thicker and more oppressive, while its movements through the undergrowth created sounds that spoke of things breaking and tearing in ways that flesh and bone were never meant to endure. Ciri's terror in that moment was so complete and overwhelming that it transcended normal fear and entered the realm of primal panic that strips away all pretense and civilization, leaving only the raw will to survive. She pressed herself against the trunk of an ancient tree, whose bark was rough enough to tear at her fine dress, while the creature circled her with the patient confidence of a predator that knows its prey has no hope of escape. Yet it was precisely at this moment of ultimate peril that salvation appeared in forms both familiar and strange. The white-haired figure who emerged from the deeper shadows of the forest moved with the fluid grace of someone who belonged in this wild place as completely as the trees themselves. His pale skin and cat-like eyes marked him as something other than entirely human, while the silver sword that hung at his side spoke of purposes and battles that ordinary mortals could barely imagine. Beside him walked a creature of such ethereal beauty that Ciri's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The Dryad Bran possessed the timeless perfection of the forest itself, her movements flowing like water over stone, while her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the accumulated wisdom of centuries spent in harmony with the natural world. Her bow was carved from wood that seemed to glow with its own inner light, while the arrows in her quiver appeared to have been crafted from materials that existed nowhere in the mortal realm. The battle that followed was unlike anything Ciri had ever witnessed, even in the training yards where Sintra's finest warriors practiced their deadly arts. Geralt moved with a precision and economy of motion that transformed violence into something approaching artistry, each stroke of his blade finding its mark with surgical accuracy, while his body flowed around the Yigan's attacks like smoke, avoiding a grasping hand. Brienne's contribution to the fight was equally impressive, but expressed through entirely different means. Her arrows flew with impossible accuracy, each one finding the exact spot where they could inflict maximum damage while avoiding any risk to the white-haired warrior who danced his deadly dance only yards away. The coordination between them spoke of either long practice or an intuitive understanding that transcended the need for words or signals. The Yigan's death came not with the roar and fury that its life had promised, but with a gradual dissolution that seemed almost peaceful by comparison. The creature's unnatural form slowly lost coherence, as Geralt's silver blade carved away the malevolent forces that had given it shape and purpose, until nothing remained but a few wisps of shadow that dispersed on the forest breeze like smoke from a dying fire. In the silence that followed this display of deadly competence, Ciri found herself the focus of attention from two beings whose very existence challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. The witch's yellow eyes studied her with an intensity that seemed to look beyond her physical appearance to examine something deeper and more essential, while the Dryad's gaze carried a mixture of curiosity and calculation that suggested she was weighing factors that Ciri could not even begin to understand. It was Brienne who spoke first, her voice carrying the musical quality that seemed common to all her kind, though the words themselves held implications that filled Ciri with a new and different kind of dread. The Dryad had recognized something in the young princess that marked her as suitable for a fate that would mean the end of everything Ciri had been, and the beginning of something entirely different. The journey to Duane Canel began as a walk through a forest that grew more beautiful and more alien. With every step they took deeper into its heart. The trees here were older than kingdoms, their trunks so massive that it would have taken a dozen men holding hands to encircle them, while their canopies reached so high that their tops disappeared into a green haze that might have been mist or might have been the boundary between the earthly realm and something altogether more mystical. Streams of crystal clear water wound between the ancient roots, their gentle murmuring, creating a constant background melody that seemed to speak in languages older than human speech. The very air here possessed a quality that made breathing feel different, as if each inhalation carried with it some essence of the forest's timeless tranquility and power. As they traveled together, Ciri found herself caught between wonder at the magical beauty that surrounded them and growing apprehension about her ultimate destination. Brienne's explanations about the fate that awaited her in the Dryad stronghold were delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that they seemed to assume her compliance was already assured, while Geralt's presence provided both comfort and confusion as she struggled to understand his role in whatever was about to unfold. The Witcher proved to be an unexpectedly gentle companion, his gruff exterior masking a patient kindness that emerged most clearly when Ciri's exhaustion forced them to stop and rest. He shared his meager rations without complaint, even giving her both of his apples when her complaints about hunger grew too persistent to ignore, and when her legs gave out entirely from the unaccustomed exertion of their forest journey. He lifted her onto his back with the casual ease of someone accustomed to carrying burdens far heavier than one small princess. It was during these moments of enforced intimacy, as Ciri clung to Geralt's shoulders while he carried her through the endless green cathedral of Brokilon, that she began to sense something familiar about this strange, white-haired warrior. Her grandmother had told her stories about a witcher who might one day come to claim her through some ancient law, though the details of these tales had always seemed more like fairy stories than genuine warnings about her future. Now, faced with the reality of Geralt's presence and the obvious way that both he and Brienne seemed to know more about her than she knew about herself, Ciri began to wonder whether those childhood stories might have been preparations for a destiny she had never taken seriously. The possibility both thrilled and terrified her, offering the prospect of adventure beyond anything she had ever imagined, while simultaneously threatening to sweep away all the certainties upon which her young life had been built. Their arrival at the borders of Dwayne Canal itself marked a transition from the merely wonderful to the genuinely otherworldly. Here, the Dryads had shaped their ancient home in ways that challenged human understanding of what was possible when intelligence and nature worked in perfect harmony. Buildings grew from living trees whose branches had been trained and guided over centuries to form walls and roofs and chambers that served every need while remaining vibrantly alive. Bridges of woven vines spanned streams that had been encouraged to flow in patterns that created natural moats and defensive barriers, while pathways of soft moss guided visitors along routes that revealed new wonders with every turn. The very air hummed with vitality and purpose, as if the forest itself was aware of their presence and was making judgments about their worthiness to witness its most closely guarded secrets. The blindfold that was placed over Geralt's eyes served purposes both practical and symbolic, protecting the location of the Dryad stronghold, while simultaneously marking his status as an outsider whose presence was tolerated, but not entirely trusted. Ciri's freedom to see their surroundings while Geralt stumbled along, guided only by her directions, created an unexpected intimacy between them, as she became his eyes and he became dependent upon her voice to navigate the winding paths that led deeper into the heart of Dryad territory. The trust that developed between them during this strange journey was unlike anything Ciri had ever experienced. The adults in her life had always managed and protected her through superior knowledge and authority, never allowing her to bear real responsibility for their mutual welfare. Now, for the first time, another person's safety depended entirely upon her attention and care, creating a bond that transcended the formal relationships she had known in royal courts. When they finally encountered Freixner again within the hidden precincts of Dwayne Canel, his anger at Ciri's escape and the chaos it had caused revealed just how significant her disappearance had been in the wider world beyond Brokilon's borders. Calanthe's wrath at her granddaughter's absence had been terrible to behold, her armies mobilizing against Verdun in the assumption that some harm had been deliberately done to the precious heir of Sintra's throne. The revelation of Ciri's true identity struck Geralt like a physical blow, the casual mention of her grandmother's royal title suddenly placing all of their interactions in an entirely different context. The child he had been treating as simply another lost princess was in fact the very girl who had been promised to him through the law of surprise, the unexpected consequence of his encounter with her father years earlier in the Great Hall of Sintra itself. The weight of destiny settled upon both of them in that moment, though it manifested in different ways for each. For Ciri, the knowledge that this strange and fascinating witcher was the figure from her grandmother's warnings brought both excitement and uncertainty, the prospect of adventure balanced against the fear of leaving behind everything familiar and safe. For Geralt, the realization that fate had finally caught up with him despite all his efforts to escape it created a mixture of resignation and something that might have been relief. Yet it was Ithne, the ancient and wise ruler of the Dryads, who would put both of their assumptions to the ultimate test. Her ethereal beauty masked an intelligence that had accumulated wisdom across centuries of existence, while her understanding of the deeper currents that shaped mortal destiny gave her perspectives that neither Geralt nor Ciri could hope to match. The trial she proposed was elegant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. If Ciri truly belonged to the forest, if her destiny lay in becoming one of the timeless daughters of Brokilon, then the water of Brokilon would transform her as it had transformed countless other lost girls across the ages. She would forget her human life as completely as if it had never existed. Her memories of royal halls and beloved grandmother dissolving like morning mist as she embraced a new existence among the trees. But if the bonds that connected her to Geralt were truly as strong as destiny suggested, if their fates were genuinely intertwined by forces beyond mortal understanding, then the magical water would have no power to sever what the universe itself had forged. The test would reveal the truth about their connection while simultaneously freeing Ciri to choose her own path based on genuine knowledge rather than the assumptions and fears of others. The ceremony itself took place in a grove that seemed to exist at the very heart of Brokilon's power, where ancient trees formed a natural amphitheatre around a spring whose waters reflected starlight even in the middle of the day. The gathered Dryads watched in reverent silence as their queen prepared to demonstrate truths that went beyond human understanding, their perfect faces showing neither hope nor concern, but only the patient acceptance of those who have learned to trust in the wisdom of forces greater than themselves. When Ciri lifted the cup of sacred water to her lips, the moment stretched like an eternity as everyone present held their breath to see what fate had decreed. The liquid itself seemed to glow with its own inner light, carrying within it the concentrated essence of everything that made Brokilon a place apart from the ordinary world, while the ancient magic it contained reached out to touch the deepest parts of her being. Yet when she lowered the empty cup and looked around at the expectant faces surrounding her, Ciri remained utterly unchanged. Her memories of her grandmother's court remained as vivid as ever, her love for the white-haired witcher burning in her heart with undiminished intensity, her certainty that her destiny lay with Geralt rather than among the timeless daughters of the forest as clear and unshakable as starlight itself. The test had spoken with a clarity that none could dispute. Yet Geralt's stubborn refusal to accept its implications revealed the depth of his fear about embracing the destiny that had been offered to him. His certainty that he brought only death and danger to those he cared about ran so deep that even this dramatic proof of their connection could not overcome his conviction that Ciri would be safer and happier without him in her life. When Aithne offered him the same sacred water that had left Ciri unchanged, challenging him to experience the visions that would show him the truth about their shared past and destined future, Geralt's acceptance came more from exhaustion than genuine willingness to embrace whatever truths might be revealed to him. The liquid burned like fire as it passed his lips, carrying him into realms of memory and possibility that existed beyond the normal boundaries of mortal experience. In those visions, he witnessed again the moment when destiny had first bound him to the child who had not yet been born, saw clearly the forces that had shaped their separate journeys toward this meeting in the heart of an ancient forest. He experienced Ciri's perspective on their brief time together, understanding for the first time how profoundly their connection had affected her and how deeply she had mourned his departure from her life. When he finally emerged from the magical trance, it was to find Ciri keeping vigil beside him with the patience and devotion of someone who understood that their bond transcended any obstacles his doubts might create. Her presence had anchored him during his journey through the realm of visions, providing the link that ensured his safe return to ordinary consciousness and confirming beyond any possibility of denial that their destinies were indeed inextricably intertwined. Yet even this profound experience was not enough to convince the stubborn Witcher to fully embrace the role that fate had prepared for him. His departure from Brokilon carried with it all the weight of paths not taken and destinies deferred, while Ciri's desperate cries from the hilltop behind him echoed with prophetic certainty about the futility of trying to escape what the universe itself had decreed. The forest closed behind him like a door shutting on possibilities that might have changed everything, while ahead lay only the familiar path of solitary wandering that he had convinced himself was the only life he was suited for. Yet destiny, as Ciri had warned him, was not so easily denied, and the threads that connected them would continue to pull them toward each other regardless of any mortal attempts to sever what the gods themselves had woven together in the fabric of fate itself. In the grand halls of Hyrule Castle, where tapestries depicting ancient victories adorned stone walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless generations, the wheels of destiny were turning with inexorable force toward a collision that would reshape not only the kingdom, but the very fabric of reality itself. The carefully laid plans of a decade had reached their moment of culmination, yet the forces set in motion by ancient prophecy and mortal ambition would prove far more catastrophic than even the wisest scholars had dared to imagine. Emir var Emrys, who had once walked the halls of Sintra, disguised as the cursed nobleman Duni, now ruled the vast empire of Nilfgaard with an authority that stretched across continents and commanded the loyalty of armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. His transformation from hedgehog-cursed exile to supreme emperor represented one of history's most remarkable reversals of fortune, yet the crown that sat upon his head brought with it burdens that no amount of political power could ease. The prophecy that Vilgefortz had shown him so many years ago continued to burn in his memory like a brand upon his consciousness, its words promising that through his union with his own daughter, a child would be born, whose offspring would rule the world itself. The very concept violated every natural law and moral principle that civilized society held sacred, yet the lure of ultimate power and the supposed salvation of the world from coming destruction proved stronger than paternal instincts or ethical considerations. Vilgefortz, the master manipulator who had orchestrated so much of the tragedy that had befallen the royal family of Sintra, continued to weave his web of deceit and ambition from the shadows of political intrigue. His true allegiance had never been to any kingdom or cause, save his own insatiable hunger for knowledge and power, particularly the secrets contained within the elder blood that flowed through Ciri's veins like liquid starlight, carrying the potential to reshape the very foundations of magical understanding. The sorcerer's plans for the young princess went far beyond even Emma's disturbing intentions, encompassing experiments and violations that would have horrified even the most hardened practitioners of the dark arts. Where the emperor saw a means to fulfill prophecy and secure dynastic power, Vilgefortz saw only a vessel for powers that could elevate him beyond the limitations of mortal flesh and grant him dominion over forces that had remained beyond human reach since the creation of the world itself. Yet both men had underestimated the fierce protective instincts of Calanthe, the lioness of Cintra, whose love for her granddaughter burned with an intensity that made her dangerous to anyone who might threaten the child's safety. The aging queen had spent years building alliances and strengthening her kingdom's defenses specifically to protect Ciri from the various forces that sought to claim her, creating a fortress of political and military power that had seemed impregnable to outside threats. The attack that Emhyr launched against Cintra was conceived as much more than a simple military conquest, representing instead a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously, while creating chaos sufficient to mask his true purpose. The invasion would satisfy his noble's hunger for territorial expansion and martial glory, while providing cover for the abduction of his daughter, allowing him to present the operation as a strategic necessity rather than a father's twisted desire to claim his own child. The Nilfgaardian forces that swept across Cintra's borders came like a tide of black steel and burning ambition, their disciplined ranks moving with the precision of a military machine that had conquered dozens of kingdoms and never known defeat. Their banners bore the sun symbol of their empire, yet the light they brought was not the warm radiance of dawn, but the harsh glare of destruction that precedes the darkness of conquest and subjugation. Calanthe's response to the invasion demonstrated why she had earned her fearsome reputation as the Lioness of Cintra, her strategic mind and warrior's courage, rising to meet this ultimate test with a clarity and determination that inspired her troops to feats of heroism that would be remembered in song and story for generations to come. She understood from the beginning that this was no ordinary territorial war, but a specific assault designed to claim her granddaughter, and she marshaled her resources accordingly. The defense of Cintra became a symphony of desperate courage and tactical brilliance, as the kingdom's soldiers fought with the fury of men defending not merely their homeland, but everything they held sacred in life. Every street became a battlefield, every building a fortress, every citizen a potential ally in the struggle to preserve their independence against an enemy whose superior numbers and equipment seemed to make victory impossible. Yet even as the battle raged in the streets and courtyards of her capital city, Calanthe's primary concern remained the safety of the young princess, who represented both the future of their bloodline and the target of their enemies' ambitions. The Queen's plans for Ciri's protection were as carefully conceived as any military strategy, involving secret passages, trusted knights, and contingency plans that had been prepared years in advance for exactly this eventuality. The irony that would prove so devastating to these careful preparations lay in the fact that the very knight entrusted with Ciri's safety had been corrupted by Nilfgaardian gold and promises, his loyalty purchased through a combination of threats against his family and assurances of reward that proved stronger than his oaths of fealty to the crown. This treachery, hidden beneath a facade of continued service and devotion, would prove to be the fatal flaw that undermined all of Calanthe's protective measures. As the sounds of battle drew closer to the royal quarters and the smoke of burning buildings began to drift through the castle's windows, Calanthe made the most difficult decision of her life, choosing to send her beloved granddaughter away into uncertain safety, rather than keep her close where she could personally ensure her protection. The farewell between grandmother and granddaughter was brief and laden with emotions too deep for words, carrying within it the terrible knowledge that they would never see each other again. The knights who rode out from Cintra's burning castle carried with them not merely the physical person of their princess, but the hopes and dreams of an entire kingdom, their mission representing the difference between the complete extinction of their royal line and the preservation of some hope for future restoration. Their route had been carefully planned to avoid the main Nilfgaardian forces while making use of hidden paths and allied territories that might offer sanctuary until the immediate danger had passed. Yet the corruption that had infected their ranks ensured that their movements were known to their enemies from the moment they departed the castle gates. Their carefully planned escape route transformed from a path to safety into a trap designed to deliver Ciri directly into the hands of those who sought to claim her. The betrayal was executed with the cold efficiency of those who have sold their souls for advancement, caring nothing for the innocent life that hung in the balance. Cahir Mar Dyffryn Ap Sialak represented everything that was both noble and terrible about Nilfgaardian military culture, a young officer whose exceptional abilities and unwavering loyalty to the Empire had earned him rapid promotion, while simultaneously binding him to missions that challenged every moral instinct he possessed. His assignment to capture the fleeing princess was presented to him as a matter of military necessity, the successful completion of a strategic objective that would help bring the war to a swift conclusion and save lives on both sides. The internal conflict that raged within Cahir's heart as he pursued his assigned mission reflected the broader tragedy of the entire invasion, as honorable men found themselves compelled to perform dishonorable acts in service to causes they did not fully understand. His reluctance to participate in what amounted to the kidnapping of a child was evident in every aspect of his behavior, yet his conditioning as a soldier and his loyalty to his superiors proved stronger than his personal moral reservations. The massive winged helmet that marked Cahir as one of Nilfgaard's elite cavalry units was designed to inspire terror in enemies and project an image of otherworldly menace that would break the spirits of those who faced them in battle. The elaborate metalwork that formed great bird wings spreading from either side of his head created a silhouette that seemed more demonic than human, transforming an ordinary young soldier into a figure of nightmare that would haunt the dreams of those who glimpsed him. When Cahir's forces finally intercepted the fleeing Cintrian knights on a road that had been chosen specifically for its isolation and lack of witnesses, the brief battle that followed was less a fair fight than an execution carried out with military precision. The corrupted knight who had led Ciri into this trap fell with the first charge, his treachery rewarded with death as his former comrades realized too late the depths of his betrayal and the hopelessness of their situation. The sight of armed men falling all around her while she cowered beneath the body of a dying horse filled Ciri with a terror that transcended normal fear and entered the realm of primal panic that strips away all rational thought. The sounds of steel striking steel, the screams of wounded men and dying horses, and the smell of blood and smoke created a sensory assault that overwhelmed her young mind and left her paralyzed with shock. It was in this moment of absolute vulnerability that Cahir's true character revealed itself, as the young officer who had seemed so fearsome in his elaborate armor proved to be nothing more than a frightened young man trying to complete a distasteful mission with as little additional harm as possible. His attempts to coax Ciri from her hiding place beneath the fallen horse were gentle, despite the urgency of his situation, his voice carrying a kindness that his appearance completely belied. When persuasion proved insufficient to overcome Ciri's terror, Cahir made the difficult decision to approach her directly, removing himself from the safety of his mounted position to kneel beside the trapped child and free her from the weight of the dead animal that pinned her to the ground. The moment when his gauntleted hands touched her small body was the beginning of a bond that would define both of their lives in ways that neither could possibly foresee. The panic that seized Ciri when she first looked up into the face of Cahir's winged helmet was so profound that it caused her to faint from sheer terror, her mind unable to process the sight of what appeared to be a supernatural predator leaning over her with obvious intent to carry her away. The elaborate metalwork that had been designed to intimidate enemies in battle proved far too effective when deployed against a child whose imagination transformed it into something beyond mortal horror. Cahir's response to Ciri's unconsciousness revealed the fundamental decency that lay beneath his fearsome exterior as he wrapped her carefully in his own cloak to protect her from the flames that were beginning to spread through the area where they had fought. His handling of the unconscious child was as gentle as that of a protective older brother, every movement calculated to ensure her safety and comfort despite the chaotic circumstances that surrounded them. The journey that followed tested both Cahir's military training and his human compassion, as he attempted to navigate through a landscape that had been transformed into a war zone while carrying a burden that was both precious and dangerous to his own survival. The burning city behind them cast an orange glow against the night sky that could be seen for miles in every direction, while ahead lay only uncertainty and the knowledge that his actions had irrevocably changed the course of events for everyone involved. The refugee stream that Cahir joined in order to conceal his movements represented the human cost of the invasion in its most immediate and heartbreaking form, as families who had lost everything they owned fled through the darkness, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, while seeking some place of safety that might not even exist. Their faces reflected the exhaustion and despair of people whose world had collapsed around them in a single night, yet they continued to move forward, driven by the simple animal instinct for survival. When Cahir finally stopped to rest beside a stream whose waters reflected the firelight from the burning city like liquid flame, his exhaustion was matched only by his growing uncertainty about the wisdom of the mission he had been assigned. The sight of Ciri sleeping peacefully in his arms, her face relaxed in innocent trust, despite everything she had endured, awakened protective instincts that he had not known he possessed, and that directly conflicted with his duties as a Nilfgaardian officer. The moment of Cahir's own collapse into exhausted sleep represented a turning point in the trajectory of events, as the careful plans of emperors and sorcerers gave way to the chaotic unpredictability of human nature and individual choice. The young soldier who had begun this mission as an instrument of imperial policy was becoming something far more complex and dangerous to his superiors' intentions, though he himself remained unaware of the transformation taking place within his heart. When Ciri awakened alone beside the stream with no memory of how she had arrived there, and no sign of the winged figure who had carried her to safety, her first instinct was to flee as far and as fast as her legs could carry her. The trauma of watching her protectors die and being captured by enemies had created a psychological wound that would take years to heal, while the image of Cahir's helmet had burned itself into her memory as a symbol of everything that threatened her safety and happiness. The landscape through which Ciri now wandered alone was one that had been fundamentally transformed by war, where familiar landmarks had been destroyed and safe roads had become deadly traps for the unwary. The smoke that rose from burning buildings in every direction created a pall that blocked out the sun and filled the air with the acrid scent of destruction, while the constant, distant sound of battle served as a reminder that danger could appear from any direction without warning. For 2 weeks that felt like an eternity, Ciri survived in this hellish landscape through a combination of desperate cunning and sheer luck, learning skills that no princess should ever need to acquire as she foraged for food among the ruins and hid from the various armed groups that roamed the countryside in pursuit of plunder or strategic advantage. The innocent child who had grown up surrounded by luxury and protection was transformed by necessity into something approaching a wild animal, driven by instincts that civilization had barely managed to suppress. The horrors that Ciri witnessed during her time alone in the war zone would remain with her for the rest of her life, images of cruelty and suffering that no child should ever be exposed to, searing themselves into her memory with traumatic intensity. She saw villages that had been burned to the ground with their inhabitants still inside, encountered refugees who had been murdered by bandits for their meager possessions, and witnessed acts of violence that challenged her fundamental understanding of human nature. Yet even in this landscape of nightmare and despair, Ciri's remarkable resilience and natural intelligence enabled her to survive where many adults would have perished, her small size and quick reflexes allowing her to hide in places where larger people could not follow, while her noble upbringing provided her with reserves of determination that lesser individuals might have lacked. The training she had received in Cintra's halls, which had seemed like mere formality in peacetime, now proved invaluable as she drew upon lessons in geography, languages, and survival skills that her tutors had never imagined she would need. The band of refugees that Ciri eventually joined represented a cross-section of Cintra's population, brought together by shared tragedy and mutual dependence, their diverse backgrounds and social classes temporarily rendered meaningless by the equalizing force of common suffering. Merchants who had once commanded respect through their wealth now possessed nothing more than the clothes on their backs, while servants and nobles found themselves sharing the same meager rations and sleeping under the same inadequate shelters. This month of travel with the refugee caravan provided Ciri with an education in human nature that no royal tutor could have provided, as she observed how people responded to extreme stress and deprivation in ways that revealed both the best and worst aspects of their characters. Some individuals rose to heights of selfless heroism that inspired hope for the future of human civilization, while others descended into depths of selfishness and cruelty that suggested civilization was nothing more than a thin veneer covering mankind's essentially brutal nature. The Druids who eventually discovered Ciri among the refugees represented one of the few sources of genuine kindness and wisdom that remained in a world that had seemingly abandoned both virtues in favor of violence and self-interest. These devoted servants of nature and healing had continued their work of tending to the wounded and comforting the desperate throughout the chaos of war, maintaining their commitment to preserving life, even when death seemed to reign supreme over all human endeavors. The Druid Grove, where Ciri found temporary sanctuary, existed as an island of peace and natural beauty in the midst of the devastation that surrounded it, its ancient trees and sacred springs remaining untouched by the violence that had transformed the rest of the landscape into a wasteland of ash and broken stone. Here, among people who valued wisdom over wealth and compassion over conquest, Ciri began the slow process of healing from the traumas she had endured while learning skills that would serve her well in the challenges that lay ahead. Yet even this haven could not remain her permanent refuge, for the Druids understood that her destiny lay elsewhere, and that their role was merely to preserve her life until the proper moment arrived for her to continue her journey. The peasant woman who eventually took responsibility for Ciri's care represented another link in the chain of unlikely protectors who would guide her toward her ultimate reunion with the Witcher, who had been promised her guardianship so many years earlier. The 6 months that Ciri spent in the humble cottage of her peasant guardian provided her with experiences that no royal upbringing could have offered, as she learned to find satisfaction in simple tasks and discovered strengths within herself that she had never suspected existed. The manual labor that filled her days was hard and often tedious. Yet, it also connected her to the natural rhythms of seasonal change and agricultural cycles that had sustained human civilization since its earliest beginnings. The woman who cared for Ciri during this period asked no questions about her origins and expected no reward for her kindness, representing the sort of fundamental human decency that survives even in the darkest times and provides hope for the eventual restoration of justice and compassion to a wounded world. Her quiet strength and practical wisdom offered Ciri a model of adulthood that was very different from the political maneuvering and courtly intrigue she had observed in royal circles, demonstrating that true nobility could exist in the humblest circumstances. It was during this period of deceptive tranquility that Geralt finally found his way back to the child who had been promised to him by destiny itself, his arrival representing the culmination of a search that had taken him across multiple kingdoms and through dangers that would have daunted lesser men. The meeting between Yerga and the Witcher that would lead to this reunion began as a simple business transaction between a desperate man and a professional monster hunter, yet it would ultimately reveal the workings of fate in ways that neither participant could have anticipated. Yerga's need for Geralt's services was urgent and genuine, as the threat he faced was beyond the capabilities of ordinary warriors to handle, yet his insistence on paying through the law of surprise, rather than conventional currency, suggested the intervention of forces beyond mere coincidence. The same ancient law that had first bound Ciri to Geralt would once again bring them together, demonstrating that some bonds transcend mortal understanding and cannot be severed by war, tragedy, or the passage of time. The battle that left Geralt wounded and dependent upon Yerga's assistance was fierce enough to challenge even the legendary skills of a Witcher at the height of his abilities, serving as a reminder that even the most capable individuals sometimes require the help of others to survive the trials that life presents. The merchant's decision to care for the injured warrior, despite the potential risks to his own safety, revealed a nobility of character that would soon be rewarded in ways he could never have imagined. When they finally arrived at Yerga's home to discover that his wife had taken in a mysterious child with ashen hair, the workings of destiny became so obvious that even the most skeptical observer would have been forced to acknowledge the presence of supernatural forces shaping mortal events. The law of surprise had once again fulfilled its purpose, bringing together individuals whose fates were intertwined by bonds stronger than any human institution or natural law. The moment when Ciri finally saw Geralt standing in the doorway of the humble cottage where she had found temporary refuge was one of pure recognition and joy that transcended all the pain and fear she had endured during their long separation. Her cry of his name and her desperate rush into his arms represented not merely the reunion of two individuals, but the restoration of a connection that had been torn apart by circumstance but never truly severed by time or distance. The embrace between the Witcher and his child surprise contained within it all the emotions that words could never adequately express, as two souls that had been searching for each other across a war-torn landscape finally found the peace and completeness that only their reunion could provide. In Geralt's arms, Ciri found the safety and protection that she had been seeking since the night Sintra fell, while the Witcher discovered that the bonds of destiny could indeed provide the family and purpose that his solitary existence had always lacked. The tears that both of them shed in that moment of reunion were not merely expressions of relief and happiness, but acknowledgements of all they had lost and found during their time apart, while their whispered promises of never again being separated carried the weight of oaths sworn before the altar of fate itself. The future that stretched before them was uncertain and undoubtedly filled with dangers that would test their bond to its limits, yet in that moment of perfect understanding and mutual devotion, nothing else in the world seemed to matter beyond the simple fact that they were finally together again. The ancient fortress of Kaer Morhen stood like a monument to forgotten ages against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains, its weathered stones bearing witness to centuries of secrets that had shaped the destiny of witchers and the world they served. Here, in this remote stronghold where the wind carried echoes of battles long past, and the very air seemed thick with the weight of accumulated wisdom, Ciri would begin the next phase of her extraordinary journey toward understanding the true nature of her heritage and the responsibilities that came with powers beyond mortal comprehension. The keep itself was a testament to the pragmatic brutality that had always characterized the Witcher way of life, its architecture designed not for comfort or beauty, but for the harsh realities of training young men to face monsters that existed beyond the nightmares of ordinary people. Every stone had been placed with purpose, every corridor designed to teach lessons about survival, every chamber crafted to forge ordinary children into something capable of standing against forces that could tear apart kingdoms with their malevolence. Geralt's decision to bring Ciri to this place represented both a practical necessity and an emotional leap of faith that challenged everything he had believed about his own nature and destiny. The Witcher, who had spent his entire adult life avoiding the complications of human attachment, now found himself responsible for nurturing and protecting a child whose importance to the world's future exceeded even his considerable ability to comprehend. The other Witchers who called Kaer Morhen home greeted Ciri's arrival with a mixture of curiosity and profound uncertainty that reflected the unprecedented nature of her situation. Never before in the long history of their brotherhood had they been called upon to train someone who was not destined to undergo the mutations that would transform her into one of their kind, yet whose natural abilities and mystical heritage clearly marked her as someone requiring their particular expertise. Vesemir, the ancient master whose knowledge of Witcher lore stretched back to the Order's founding, understood better than his younger colleagues the significance of what Geralt had brought to their sanctuary. His weathered features bore the marks of centuries spent in service to humanity's protection, while his eyes held depths of wisdom that came only from surviving conflicts that had claimed the lives of countless brothers in arms. The old Witcher's assessment of Ciri's potential was both encouraging and deeply troubling, for he recognized in her the same restless energy and intuitive understanding of danger that had marked the greatest champions in their order's history. Yet he also sensed something else entirely, a power that operated according to laws that even his vast experience could not fully explain or predict. The training regimen that the Witchers devised for Ciri was an adaptation of techniques that had been refined over generations to transform ordinary boys into superhuman warriors, modified as best they could manage to account for her unique circumstances and the different requirements of her ultimate destiny. The physical conditioning was brutal by any standard, designed to push her body beyond its natural limitations, while building the reflexes and endurance that would be essential for survival in a world where death could come from any shadow. The obstacle courses that filled Kaer Morhen's courtyards and training chambers were engineering marvels of deadly ingenuity, each element designed to teach specific lessons about balance, timing, and the split-second decision-making that separated living witches from dead heroes. Spinning blades emerged from walls without warning, forcing trainees to develop supernatural awareness of their surroundings, while pits filled with pointed stakes taught the consequences of carelessness in ways that mere instruction never could. Ciri's natural athleticism and fierce determination served her well in these trials, though her small stature and lack of supernatural mutations meant that she had to rely on speed and intelligence where her trainers could depend on enhanced strength and reflexes. The bruises that covered her body after each day's training were testament to the brutality of the regimen, yet they also marked her progress toward a level of physical competence that few mortals ever achieved. The weapons training that formed another crucial component of her education introduced Ciri to arts of violence that transformed the human body into an instrument capable of dealing death with scientific precision. The swords that had seemed so romantic and exciting in the stories of her childhood proved to be tools of such devastating efficiency that even their practice versions could inflict serious injury if wielded carelessly or without proper respect for their lethal potential. Under the patient guidance of masters who had spent their entire lives perfecting these deadly arts, Ciri learned to move like flowing water around an opponent's attacks while striking back with the focused fury of lightning finding its target. Her footwork became a dance of evasion and aggression that maximized her natural advantages while minimizing her physical disadvantages, turning her youth and agility into weapons that could overcome larger and stronger opponents. The theoretical education that accompanied her physical training opened Ciri's mind to aspects of the world that remained hidden from ordinary people, revealing the complex ecosystem of supernatural threats that existed parallel to mortal civilization. She learned to identify the signs that marked the presence of different categories of monsters, understanding not only how to destroy them, but why they existed and what role they played in the broader balance of natural forces. The bestiary that she memorized contained descriptions of creatures so terrifying that their mere existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Yet the witches taught her to approach even the most dangerous entities with the calm, analytical mindset of a scholar rather than the panic of a victim. Knowledge was power in their world, and the difference between life and death often came down to recognizing the specific weaknesses that could be exploited in creatures that seemed otherwise invincible. The alchemical studies that formed another branch of her education introduced Ciri to the ancient arts of brewing potions and preparing weapons that could enhance human capabilities or provide specific advantages against particular types of supernatural threats. The laboratory beneath Kaer Morhen contained ingredients gathered from across the known world, many of them so rare and dangerous that their very presence in the fortress represented decades of careful acquisition and preparation. The herbs and oils that the witches fed to Ciri were designed to gradually enhance her natural abilities without subjecting her to the traumatic mutations that transformed boys into their order. Yet the effects of these treatments were both beneficial and deeply unsettling. Her strength and speed increased noticeably with each passing week, while her senses became so acute that she could detect the presence of enemies or danger long before they became visible to normal perception. Yet it was not the physical changes in Ciri that most concerned her trainers, but rather the strange episodes that began to occur with increasing frequency as her training progressed. These mysterious trances seemed to come upon her without warning, transforming the alert and engaged student into someone whose consciousness appeared to exist in entirely different realms, while her body remained trapped in ordinary physical reality. The first such incident occurred during what should have been a routine training exercise, as Ciri navigated one of the fortress's more challenging obstacle courses with the fluid grace that had become her trademark. Without any apparent trigger or warning, she suddenly stopped moving entirely, her eyes taking on a glazed quality that suggested her awareness had been transported to places far removed from the physical world around her. The words that emerged from her lips during this trance bore no resemblance to her normal patterns of speech, carrying instead the cadence and vocabulary of someone far older and more experienced in matters of prophecy and divine revelation. The pronouncements she made seemed to relate to events that had not yet occurred, describing scenes and situations that existed only in the realm of possibility rather than present reality. When she finally emerged from this mysterious state, Ciri had no memory of what had transpired during her absence from normal consciousness, leaving her trainers to puzzle over the meaning of utterances that seemed to carry significant weight despite their often cryptic and symbolic nature. The incident was disturbing enough that Vesemir ordered increased observation of their unusual student, though none of the witches possessed sufficient knowledge of magical phenomena to properly interpret what they were witnessing. The second episode proved even more dramatic and unsettling than the first, occurring during a sparring session when Ciri had been pushed beyond her normal limits by an opponent whose superior size and strength should have made victory impossible. The intensity of the combat seemed to trigger something deep within her consciousness, opening pathways to power that she had never consciously accessed before. This time, the trance was accompanied by physical manifestations that could not be dismissed as mere hallucination or psychological phenomenon, as objects throughout the training chamber began to move without any apparent cause, while the temperature dropped so dramatically that the breath of everyone present became visible in clouds of crystalline vapor. The very air seemed to thicken with potential energy, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and dread that affected even the experienced witchers who had faced countless supernatural threats without flinching. The prophecies that Ciri spoke during this second episode were more coherent and specific than her earlier utterances, containing detailed descriptions of battles yet to be fought and losses yet to be suffered. She spoke of the death of Cohen, one of the younger witches present, describing his final moments with such vivid accuracy that those who heard her words would never forget them, though they would not understand their true significance until much later, when fate fulfilled her grim predictions with terrible precision. More disturbing still was her vision of Geralt's own demise, delivered in tones of such sorrow and finality that the White Wolf himself felt a chill of premonition that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold that filled the chamber. The description of his death was so detailed and emotionally charged that it seemed to come from the perspective of someone who had witnessed the event firsthand. Yet the future she described had not yet come to pass, and might still be changed through conscious action and careful planning. The third episode proved to be the most frightening yet, occurring not during the heat of training, but in the quiet hours after a particularly intense nightmare had left Ciri shaking and disoriented in her chambers. The terror that had filled her dreams seemed to follow her into waking consciousness, creating a bridge between the realm of sleep and the world of prophecy that allowed visions of unprecedented clarity and horrifying accuracy. This time, her predictions dealt not with distant future events, but with immediate dangers that threatened the safety of everyone in Kaer Morhen, describing in precise detail the approach of enemies whose existence none of the fortress's defenders had suspected. The accuracy of these warnings would soon be proven when scouts confirmed the presence of hostile forces in the surrounding mountains, their movements matching exactly the patterns that Ciri had described while lost in her prophetic trance. The realization that their unusual student possessed genuine prophetic abilities rather than merely experiencing psychological disturbances forced the witches to confront the possibility that they were dealing with forces beyond their expertise to handle safely. The mutations and training that had prepared them to face physical monsters provided no guidance for dealing with supernatural phenomena that operated according to entirely different laws and principles. Vesemir's decision to seek outside assistance represented a significant departure from the traditional Witcher philosophy of self-reliance and independence, yet the welfare of both Ciri and everyone else in the fortress demanded that they acknowledge the limitations of their knowledge and seek help from those better equipped to understand the nature of her abilities. The message that went out to Triss Merigold was carefully worded to convey the urgency of their situation without revealing too much information that might be intercepted by hostile forces. Triss Merigold's arrival at Kaer Morhen brought with her not only the magical expertise that the situation required, but also a feminine perspective that had been entirely absent from Ciri's education up to that point. The sorceress's first glimpse of their unusual student revealed immediately that the witches, despite their good intentions and considerable expertise, had been approaching her training with assumptions and methods that failed to account for some very fundamental aspects of her nature and needs. The encounter between Ciri and Triss on the path to the fortress provided the sorceress with her first direct experience of the prophetic episodes that had so concerned the witches, as the young woman's consciousness was suddenly seized by forces beyond her control while they rode together through the mountain passes. The voice that spoke through Ciri during this incident carried overtones of menace and knowledge that suggested the presence of an intelligence far older and more powerful than the girl herself. The warning that emerged from Ciri's lips during this trance contained implications that chilled Triss to the bone, speaking of ancient powers and hidden agendas that threatened not only Ciri's safety, but the stability of the entire magical community. The phrase about mistaking stars reflected in water for the heavens themselves would prove to be a recurring theme in the mysterious messages that seemed to flow through the girl, suggesting the involvement of entities whose understanding of reality operated on levels that mortal minds could barely comprehend. When they finally reached Kaer Morhen proper, Triss's trained eye immediately assessed the situation with a clarity that had eluded the fortress's permanent residents, recognizing signs and symptoms that pointed to a diagnosis far more significant than mere psychological disturbance or adolescent confusion. The combination of prophetic visions, supernatural phenomena, and the girl's obvious bloodline heritage created a pattern that could only lead to one conclusion about the true nature of her abilities. The revelation that Ciri was a source, rather than merely an unusually gifted child, transformed the entire context of her training and the challenges that lay ahead. For sources represented a category of magical being so rare and powerful that even experienced sorceresses like Triss had encountered only a handful of them during their entire careers. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond the walls of Kaer Morhen, affecting the balance of power between various magical factions and potentially altering the course of political events across multiple kingdoms. A source, in the technical terminology of magical theory, represented an individual whose natural capacity for wielding supernatural forces exceeded normal human limitations, to such a degree that their abilities operated according to entirely different principles than conventional magic. Where ordinary sorcerers and sorceresses required years of training to master even basic spells, sources could unconsciously manipulate reality itself when their emotions reached sufficient intensity, creating effects that defied conventional understanding of magical law. The danger inherent in untrained sources was legendary among those who studied magical phenomena, for their unconscious use of power could create catastrophic results that endangered not only themselves, but everyone in their vicinity. The energy that flowed through them was like a raging river that could either be channeled to useful purposes through proper training and discipline, or left to flood and destroy everything in its path if allowed to run wild without guidance or control. Triss's examination of Ciri's living conditions within the fortress revealed additional problems that had nothing to do with her magical nature, but everything to do with the fundamental differences between male and female adolescent development that the witches had simply failed to consider when designing her training program. The accommodations that had been adequate for boys undergoing the transformation into witches were completely inappropriate for a young woman whose body was changing according to entirely different patterns and needs. The discovery of the extensive bruising that covered Ciri's body from the brutal training regimen shocked Triss into immediate action. Her maternal instincts aroused by the sight of injuries that spoke of treatment more suited to breaking a wild animal than educating a precious child. The realization that the witches had been feeding her alchemical preparations designed for male physiology without considering the effects on female hormonal development filled the sorceress with fury that erupted in a torrent, multilingual profanity that impressed even the fortress's residents. The confrontation between Triss and the assembled witches over their treatment of Ciri was epic in its scope and devastating in its effectiveness, as the sorceress's combination of moral outrage and superior magical knowledge left them with no choice but to acknowledge their failures and accept her guidance in matters they clearly did not understand. The sight of their supposedly invincible guardians being thoroughly chastened by a woman who barely reached Geralt's shoulder provided Ciri with a new perspective on the relative nature of power and authority. The most embarrassing revelation came when Triss discovered that none of the witches had even realized that Ciri had begun menstruating, a development that had left the girl in considerable physical discomfort and emotional distress as she struggled to deal with changes that no one had prepared her to understand or manage. The masculine environment of the fortress provided no guidance for navigating the complexities of female adolescence, leaving Ciri to suffer in silence rather than risk appearing weak or burdensome. Triss's intervention in this aspect of Ciri's development was both practical and symbolically important, providing not only immediate relief from physical discomfort, but also establishing new protocols that acknowledged the fundamental reality that their student was growing into a young woman, rather than simply a smaller version of a witcher. The beautiful dress that replaced Ciri's practical training clothes served as a visible reminder that femininity was not incompatible with strength or capability. The establishment of new rules regarding Ciri's training schedule that took into account the natural rhythms of her body represented a revolutionary departure from traditional witcher methodology, yet it proved to be both more humane and more effective than the previous approach. The recognition that rest and recovery were as important as constant exertion allowed for more intensive and focused training sessions that achieved better results in less time while reducing the risk of serious injury. Triss's extended stay at Kaer Morhen allowed her to conduct a thorough assessment of Ciri's magical abilities and the various phenomena that had been causing such concern among her guardians, revealing patterns and connections that gradually built toward a comprehensive understanding of the forces at work within the girl's developing consciousness. The sorceress's expertise in theoretical magic provided the framework needed to interpret visions and episodes that had seemed random and inexplicable to those without proper training. The controlled experiment that Triss conducted using White Seagull to induce one of Ciri's prophetic states was both illuminating and deeply disturbing, as it allowed direct observation of the forces that operated through the girl, while also revealing the presence of an external intelligence that seemed to be using her consciousness as a conduit for its own purposes. The decision to enter Ciri's vision directly through magical means represented a significant risk that few sorceresses would have been willing to take. The landscape that Triss encountered within Ciri's prophetic trance was one of symbolic imagery and emotional resonance that spoke to deep currents of fate and destiny operating beneath the surface of ordinary reality. The vision of Sodden Hill, where so many sorceresses had died in battle, carried personal significance for Triss that made the experience both more meaningful and more traumatic than it might have been for another observer. The encounter with the mysterious entity that spoke through Ciri during these episodes revealed the presence of an intelligence whose knowledge and power operated on scales that dwarfed mortal understanding, yet whose intentions remained frustratingly unclear, despite the obvious threat it represented to everyone involved. The repeated warnings about mistaking reflections for reality suggested layers of deception and misdirection that made it impossible to trust even direct communication from this source. The physical and emotional toll that these magical investigations took on both Ciri and Triss demonstrated the serious dangers inherent in dealing with forces that operated beyond normal magical theory, while the failure to identify the source of the external influence left everyone involved with a sense of unease that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. The recommendation to seek assistance from Yennefer represented an acknowledgement that even Triss's considerable expertise was insufficient to fully understand or control the phenomena they were dealing with. The decision to send Ciri to the temple school at Elanda provided a temporary solution to the immediate problems while offering hope that a more structured educational environment might provide better opportunities for developing both her magical abilities and her understanding of the broader world beyond Kaer Morhen's walls. The departure from the fortress marked the end of one phase of her education and the beginning of another that would prove to be equally challenging in entirely different ways. The bond that had developed between Ciri and her Witcher guardians during her stay at Kaer Morhen was one of genuine affection and mutual respect that transcended the traditional boundaries between teacher and student, creating relationships that would endure regardless of physical separation or the passage of time. The lessons she had learned about courage, determination, and the willingness to face impossible odds in defense of others would serve her well in trials that lay ahead, while the skills she had acquired would prove essential for her ultimate survival. The weapons training that had seemed so brutal and excessive would eventually reveal its true value when Ciri faced enemies whose power and malevolence exceeded anything the Witchers had encountered in their long careers, while the alchemical knowledge she had absorbed would provide solutions to problems that conventional magic could not address. The physical conditioning that had left her bruised and exhausted would prove to be the foundation for supernatural endurance that would carry her through ordeals that would have destroyed lesser individuals. Most importantly, the time spent among the Witchers had given Ciri a new understanding of what it meant to be part of a family bound together not by blood, but by shared purpose and mutual commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. This sense of belonging and responsibility would become one of her greatest sources of strength during the dark times ahead, providing an anchor of identity and purpose that would prevent her from being completely consumed by the various forces that sought to claim her for their own ends. As the towers of Kaer Morhen disappeared behind the hills that surrounded their hidden valley, Ciri carried with her not only the practical skills and knowledge that the Witchers had imparted, but also something far more precious and enduring: the absolute certainty that she was loved and valued for herself, rather than merely for the power she possessed or the destiny she was meant to fulfill. This understanding would sustain her through trials that would test every aspect of her character and abilities, providing the inner strength needed to remain true to herself, no matter what temptations or threats the future might bring. The ancient island of Thaned rose from the waters of the Yaruga estuary like a monument to magical learning and political intrigue, its towering spires and elegant architecture serving as home to both the prestigious Academy of Aretusa and the gathering place for the most powerful sorcerers and sorceresses in the known world. Here, where centuries of magical tradition had created an atmosphere thick with accumulated power and ancient wisdom, the forces that had been building toward confrontation for years would finally collide in ways that would reshape the political landscape of the Northern Kingdoms forever. The invitation that had brought Princess Ciri and Yennefer to this fateful gathering had been presented as an opportunity for the young woman to observe the workings of high magical politics while continuing her education under the guidance of one of the most accomplished sorceresses of her generation. Yet beneath the surface of academic ceremony and scholarly discourse, currents of conspiracy and betrayal were already flowing toward a climax that would test every alliance and reveal the true loyalties of those who claimed to serve the cause of justice and order. Ciri's arrival on Thaned marked her first exposure to the rarefied atmosphere of high magical society, where power was measured not in armies or territories, but in the subtle manipulation of forces that could reshape reality itself, according to the will of those who possessed sufficient knowledge and skill to command them. The young woman who had grown up in royal courts and trained in the harsh practicality of Witcher strongholds found herself in an environment where every conversation carried multiple layers of meaning and where apparent allies might prove to be enemies in disguise. The gathering itself represented the culmination of months of careful planning and political maneuvering, as representatives of various magical factions came together ostensibly to discuss matters of academic interest, while actually engaging in negotiations that would determine the fate of kingdoms and the lives of millions. The elegant halls and gracious gardens of the Academy provided a civilized setting for discussions that dealt with subjects of life and death importance, their beauty serving as a stark contrast to the deadly seriousness of the matters being debated. Yennefer's presence at this conclave was both personal and political, as her relationship with Ciri gave her a vested interest in the outcome of discussions that would inevitably touch upon the young woman's future and the various claims that different factions sought to press regarding her ultimate destiny. The sorceress who had once cared only for her own advancement and the pursuit of knowledge now found herself motivated by protective instincts that she had never expected to experience. The political tensions that simmered beneath the surface of scholarly discourse reflected the broader conflicts that were tearing the northern kingdoms apart, as the growing power of Nilfgaard in the south created pressure for magical practitioners to choose sides in a struggle that would determine whether their traditional independence could be maintained or whether they would be forced to serve imperial masters whose vision of order left little room for magical autonomy. Vilgefortz's presence at the gathering should have been a source of comfort to those who opposed Nilfgaardian expansion, for his reputation as a powerful sorcerer and defender of northern independence had made him one of the most respected voices in magical circles. Yet beneath his facade of scholarly wisdom and principled opposition to tyranny lay ambitions and allegiances that would soon reveal themselves in ways that would shock even those who thought they understood the true nature of magical politics. The secret meetings that took place in shadowed chambers and hidden alcoves during the official ceremonies represented the true business of the conclave, as various factions sought to build coalitions and negotiate agreements that would serve their interests. When the inevitable confrontation with Nilfgaard finally came, these discussions dealt not with abstract principles but with concrete arrangements for mutual support and the division of spoils when victory was achieved. Ciri's presence at these gatherings was both a blessing and a curse for those who sought to manipulate her fate. For while her youth and inexperience made her vulnerable to influence, her growing magical abilities and the prophetic visions that continued to manifest through her consciousness created an element of unpredictability that made long-term planning increasingly difficult for all parties involved. The young woman's education in the complexities of adult politics proved to be both fascinating and deeply troubling, as she witnessed firsthand the ways in which noble ideals could be compromised by practical necessities, and how those who claimed to serve the greater good often pursued their own interests with ruthless determination. The innocence that had survived her trials at Kaer Morhen began to erode under the weight of revelations about the true nature of power and the price that was demanded from those who sought to wield it. The prophetic episode that finally revealed the true scope of the crisis they faced came upon Ciri without warning during what should have been a routine gathering of magical dignitaries, her consciousness suddenly seized by visions of such clarity and immediate relevance that their meaning could not be dismissed or misinterpreted. The voice that spoke through her carried the authority of someone who had witnessed the events she described, though those events had not yet come to pass in the ordinary timeline of mortal experience. The declaration that the war had already begun sent shockwaves through the assembled sorcerers and sorceresses. For if Ciri's visions were accurate, then all of their careful planning and diplomatic maneuvering had been rendered meaningless by forces that were already in motion beyond their ability to influence or control. The implications of her pronouncement extended far beyond the immediate political situation, suggesting that the very foundations of magical society were about to be tested in ways that no one had anticipated. The chaos that erupted following Ciri's prophetic outburst was both literal and figurative, as the careful facades of scholarly discourse collapsed to reveal the deadly, serious nature of the conflicts that had been simmering beneath the surface of academic politeness. Alliances that had seemed secure dissolved in moments as participants revealed their true loyalties and long-hidden agendas, while accusations of treachery and betrayal flew through halls that had previously echoed with civilized debate. The violence that finally broke out across Thaned Island transformed the seat of magical learning into a battlefield where former colleagues turned their considerable powers against each other in conflicts that reduced centuries of accumulated knowledge to ash and rubble. The beautiful architecture that had taken generations to perfect was scarred and broken by energies that had never been intended for destructive use, while the gardens and courtyards became graveyards for those who had underestimated the deadly seriousness of their opponents. Vilgefortz's revelation as the architect of this catastrophe came as a shock to those who had trusted him, for his betrayal was not merely political but personal, representing the destruction of friendships and alliances that had taken years to build. The sorcerer who had presented himself as a defender of magical independence was revealed to be an agent of forces that sought to reduce all practitioners of the art to mere tools in service of imperial ambition. The coup that Vilgefortz had orchestrated was masterful in its scope and timing, striking at the heart of northern magical resistance just when unity and coordination were most desperately needed to face the Nilfgaardian threat. His ability to maintain his deception for so long spoke to both his considerable magical abilities and his complete lack of the moral constraints that governed the behavior of those who still believed in the principles they claimed to serve. Ciri's position during this unfolding catastrophe was particularly dangerous, for her value to various factions made her a prize that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands, while her growing magical abilities made her capable of defending herself in ways that could prove as dangerous to allies as to enemies. The young woman who had come to Thaned as a student found herself thrust into the role of a strategic asset whose fate would help determine the outcome of conflicts that extended far beyond the island's shores. Yennefer's desperate attempts to protect Ciri from the various forces that sought to claim her reflected the transformation that motherhood had wrought in someone who had previously been concerned primarily with her own interests. Advancement. The sorceress, who had once pursued power for its own sake, now found herself willing to sacrifice everything to ensure the safety of the young woman who had become the center of her emotional universe. The battle that raged through Thaned's halls and chambers was unlike any conflict that the participants had previously experienced, for it combined political maneuvering with deadly magical combat in ways that left no room for mercy or compromise. Former friends found themselves facing each other across battle lines that had been drawn not by choice, but by the inexorable logic of opposing loyalties and incompatible visions of the future. The escape routes that Yennefer had prepared in advance of the gathering proved to be both prescient and insufficient, for the scope of the betrayal exceeded even her considerable ability to anticipate and plan for contingencies. The careful arrangements that should have ensured Ciri's safety became death traps, as allies revealed themselves to be enemies, and trusted passages became corridors filled with hostile forces. The moment of final separation between Yennefer and Ciri carried with it all the weight of a love that transcended ordinary human bonds. As the sorceress, who had never expected to experience maternal devotion, found herself forced to send away the person who had become most precious to her in all the world. The words of love and encouragement that passed between them were both blessing and farewell, carrying the terrible knowledge that they might never see each other again. Ciri's desperate flight through the chaos of Thaned tested every skill and ability she had acquired during her time at Kaer Morhen, as she navigated through conflicts that combined political intrigue with deadly magical combat in ways that left no room for hesitation or mercy. The young woman who had learned to face monsters in training now found herself confronting enemies whose malevolence exceeded anything she had previously imagined possible. The encounter with Rience, Vilgefortz's cruel and ambitious lieutenant, provided Ciri with her first direct experience of the hatred and greed that motivated those who sought to claim her for their own purposes. The fire mage, whose power and sadistic nature had made him feared throughout magical circles, represented everything that was worst about the corruption that had infected the supposedly noble calling of sorcery. The confrontation with Cahir during her flight carried entirely different emotional weight, for this meeting forced Ciri to face the figure who had haunted her nightmares for years, while discovering that the reality behind her childhood terror was far more complex and human than her traumatic memories had allowed her to understand. The young Nilfgaardian officer, who had seemed like a demon in her recollections, proved to be nothing more than a confused and conflicted young man caught up in events beyond his understanding or control. The moment when Cahir's helmet was removed, and Ciri saw his face clearly for the first time, marked a turning point in her psychological development, as she confronted the reality that her greatest fear was based on misconceptions and childhood trauma rather than genuine supernatural threat. This recognition allowed her to begin the process of reclaiming power over her own emotional responses, while simultaneously revealing the fundamental humanity of those she had been taught to consider enemies. The desperate race to Torlara that concluded Ciri's escape from Thaned carried with it all the weight of choices that could not be undone and paths that once taken could never be retraced. The ancient tower that housed one of the most dangerous and unpredictable magical devices in the known world represented her only hope of escape from forces that sought to claim her. Yet, it also offered the possibility of transportation to destinations that might prove even more perilous than the enemies she was fleeing. The unstable portal that waited within Torlara had been constructed by magical practitioners whose understanding of dimensional travel exceeded anything that contemporary sorcerers possessed, yet whose work had been abandoned precisely because of the unpredictable and dangerous nature of the forces they had been attempting to harness. The decision to use such a device represented the ultimate gamble with forces that could transport her to safety or destroy her utterly without warning or mercy. The confrontation between Geralt and Vilgefortz that took place simultaneously with Ciri's escape represented the collision of two very different approaches to power and responsibility, as the Witcher's simple dedication to protecting those he cared about came into conflict with the sorcerer's complex schemes for reshaping the world according to his vision of proper order. The battle between them was both personal and symbolic, representing the broader struggle between those who served others and those who served only themselves. The moment when Ciri stepped through the portal and disappeared from the world she had known marked not only her escape from immediate danger, but also the beginning of a journey that would take her beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality, into realms where the normal laws of time and space held no sway. The explosion that destroyed the tower behind her served as a final punctuation mark on the end of one phase of her life and the beginning of another that would test her in ways that no training or preparation could have anticipated. The silence that followed the portal's activation was both literal and metaphorical, marking not only the absence of sound but also the void left by Ciri's departure from a world that had come to depend upon her presence in ways that none of its inhabitants fully understood. Her disappearance created ripple effects that would influence the course of events for years to come, as various factions scrambled to adjust their plans to account for the loss of the prize they had all been seeking to claim. The aftermath of the Thained coup would reshape the magical landscape of the northern kingdoms in ways that extended far beyond the immediate political consequences, creating divisions and enmities that would influence the practice of sorcery for generations to come. The trust that had once bound magical practitioners together in pursuit of common goals had been shattered by revelations of betrayal and corruption that called into question the fundamental assumptions upon which their society had been built. For Ciri herself, the journey through the portal marked the beginning of an odyssey that would take her beyond the familiar boundaries of her world, into realms where survival would depend not on the skills and knowledge she had acquired, but on inner reserves of strength and determination that she had never been forced to draw upon. The princess, who had grown up surrounded by luxury and protection, was about to discover what it truly meant to be alone in a universe that cared nothing for her noble birth or magical heritage. The Karath desert that awaited her on the other side of dimensional space was a realm of such desolation and hostility that it challenged the very concept of survival, its endless expanses of burning sand and merciless sun creating conditions that would test even the most hardened desert dwellers. Here, in this place where water was more precious than gold and shade more valuable than jewels, Ciri would be forced to confront the fundamental question of whether her will to live was strong enough to overcome circumstances that seemed designed specifically to break even the strongest spirit. The Korath Desert stretched endlessly in every direction like a sea of golden torment beneath a merciless sun that seemed to burn with the concentrated fury of divine wrath. Its vast emptiness, broken only by the occasional outcropping of sun-bleached stone that offered no shelter and promised no relief from the crushing weight of absolute desolation. Here, in this realm where life itself seemed an aberration against the natural order of things, Ciri found herself stripped of everything that had once defined her existence, reduced to the most fundamental struggle that any living creature could face. The portal that had carried her from the chaos of Thained had deposited her in the middle of this wasteland, without warning or preparation, leaving her to confront the immediate reality of survival in an environment that challenged every assumption she had ever held about the nature of existence itself. The elegant gown that had been appropriate for magical gatherings now became a liability that trapped heat against her skin, while offering no protection against the sand that filled the air with each gust of wind. The first day passed in a haze of disorientation and growing panic, as Ciri struggled to comprehend the magnitude of her situation, her mind refusing to accept that she had been transported from the familiar world of political intrigue and magical conflict into a realm that seemed actively hostile to the continuation of life. The skills she had learned at Kaer Morhen included nothing about desert survival, while her magical abilities remained frustratingly beyond her conscious control, despite the desperate circumstances that should have motivated their manifestation. The hunger that began to gnaw at her stomach by the second day was merely an inconvenience compared to the thirst that soon became the defining feature of her existence, as her body's need for water transformed from discomfort into obsession with a speed that shocked her into recognition of just how precarious her situation had become. The moisture in her mouth disappeared entirely, leaving her tongue feeling like leather, while her lips cracked and began to bleed from exposure to the dry air. By the third day, Ciri's rational mind had begun to fracture under the combined assault of physical deprivation and psychological isolation, as the silence of the desert proved even more oppressive than its heat and emptiness. The absence of any sound beyond the whisper of wind across sand created an acoustic void that seemed to press against her eardrums with almost physical weight, while the unchanging landscape offered no landmarks to suggest progress or direction. The hallucinations that began to manifest on the fourth day were subtle at first, nothing more than glimpses of movement at the edge of her vision that disappeared when she turned to look directly at them. These phantom shapes gradually became more distinct and persistent as her condition deteriorated, taking on forms that reflected both her deepest hopes for rescue and her growing terror of dying alone in this place that seemed to exist beyond the reach of divine mercy. It was during one of these episodes of fevered delirium that salvation appeared in the form of a creature so beautiful and impossible that Ciri's damaged mind initially dismissed it as merely another hallucination born from Kate, desperation, and approaching madness. The unicorn that materialized before her seemed to glow with its own inner light, its pristine white coat unmarked by the dust and grime that had transformed her into a barely recognizable shadow of her former self. The young unicorn's presence brought with it an immediate sense of peace and hope that penetrated even Ciri's delirium, though she hesitated to trust in what might prove to be nothing more than a cruel trick of her failing mind. The creature's eyes held depths of intelligence and compassion that spoke of awareness far beyond ordinary animal consciousness, while its willingness to approach someone in her desperate condition suggested either supernatural fearlessness or genuine concern for her welfare. When Ciri reached out with trembling fingers to touch the unicorn's muzzle, the solid reality of its presence beneath her hand confirmed that this was no mere product of hallucination, but an actual living being whose arrival represented the first genuine hope she had experienced since her exile began. The creature she would come to call Little Horse accepted her touch with patient gentleness, its warm breath against her palm carrying with it the promise that she would not be required to face this ordeal entirely alone. The bond that formed between them transcended the normal relationships between human and animal, representing instead a connection between two beings whose circumstances had brought them together in mutual recognition of shared vulnerability and the fundamental need for companionship in the face of overwhelming adversity. Little Horse's youth and inexperience made him as dependent upon Ciri's guidance as she was upon his knowledge of desert survival, creating a partnership based on equality rather than domination. The unicorn's initial departure left Ciri devastated by what seemed like another abandonment by forces beyond her control. Yet his return with hooves dripping with precious water revealed the depth of loyalty and understanding that characterized his nature. The muddy liquid that he led her to was far from the crystal-clear springs of her homeland, yet it represented life itself to someone whose body had begun the process of shutting down from dehydration. Their journey together across the burning sands became a testament to the power of determination and mutual support to overcome circumstances that would have destroyed either of them individually. As they learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of water or edible vegetation hidden beneath the desert's barren surface, Little Horse's natural instincts guided them toward resources that Ciri's human senses could never have detected, while her opposable thumbs and problem-solving abilities proved essential for accessing supplies that lay beyond the unicorn's physical capabilities. The attack came without warning during what should have been a routine search for water, as a creature of such hideous malevolence emerged from beneath the sand that its very presence seemed to pollute the air with concentrated evil. The monster that confronted them defied easy description, its form shifting between configurations that suggested different types of predator while maintaining a consistent aura of hunger and hatred that transcended normal animal aggression. The battle that followed tested every aspect of Ciri's training and natural abilities, as she found herself forced to protect not only her own life, but that of the innocent creature who had become her only companion in this place of desolation. The weapons she had mastered at Kaer Morhen were useless without steel to wield, leaving her to rely on improvised tools and desperate cunning to face an enemy whose supernatural nature made it nearly invulnerable to conventional attack. Little Horse's courage in the face of mortal danger revealed depths of heroism that put many human warriors to shame. As the young unicorn repeatedly placed himself between Ciri and their attacker, despite his obvious terror and the grievous wounds he sustained in the process. His willingness to sacrifice himself for her safety created a debt of honor that Ciri knew she could never fully repay, while simultaneously demonstrating the nobility that made unicorns worthy of their legendary status. The victory they achieved together came at a cost that transformed triumph into tragedy, as the monster's venomous claws left Little Horse writhing in agony from poisons that attacked his system with supernatural virulence. Ciri's frantic attempts to treat his wounds with conventional methods proved futile against toxins that operated according to magical rather than natural principles, leaving her to watch helplessly as her beloved companion's condition deteriorated with each passing hour. The desperation that filled Ciri's heart as she knelt beside the suffering unicorn transcended ordinary grief and entered the realm of spiritual crisis, as she was forced to confront her own helplessness in the face of forces that remained beyond her understanding or control. The magical abilities that she knew existed within her bloodline remained frustratingly inaccessible despite the extremity of circumstances that should have motivated their emergence, leaving her feeling more powerless than ever before in her life. The fire that she eventually built from scraps of dry vegetation and sheer determination represented more than a simple survival tool, becoming instead a focal point for energies that she had never consciously accessed, but which now called to her with seductive whispers of unlimited power. The flames danced with colors that had no names in mortal language, while their heat carried properties that extended far beyond the physical realm into dimensions where will and desire could reshape reality itself. The moment when Ciri finally reached out to touch these supernatural fires marked a fundamental transformation in her relationship with the magical forces that flowed through her veins, as the desperate love she felt for her dying companion provided the emotional catalyst needed to breach the barriers that had previously kept her powers beyond conscious reach. The energy that flooded through her body lifted her from the ground as if gravity itself had become negotiable, while her awareness expanded to encompass possibilities that mortal minds were never meant to perceive. The healing spell that flowed from her outstretched hands carried within it all the love and determination that had sustained her throughout their journey together, its golden radiance washing away the poison and pain that had brought Little Horse to the very threshold of death. The sight of her companion's wounds closing and his strength returning filled Ciri with a joy so intense that it threatened to overwhelm her rational mind, yet it also awakened hungers for power that she had never previously experienced. The voice that spoke to her from within the flames belonged to an ancestor whose name had become synonymous with rebellion and destruction, as Falca's spirit reached across the centuries to offer Ciri the power to reshape the world according to her desires. The ghostly figure that materialized from the fire carried herself with the regal bearing of someone who had once commanded armies and toppled kingdoms, yet her beauty was marred by the corruption that had consumed her soul during her pursuit of ultimate vengeance. Falca's temptations were expertly crafted to appeal to every grievance and frustration that Ciri had accumulated during her short but traumatic life, offering her the means to punish those who had harmed her, while simultaneously promising her the power to protect those she loved from any future threat. The visions that accompanied these offers showed Ciri scenes of triumph and retribution that satisfied every desire for justice that burned within her heart. Yet they also revealed the ultimate cost of accepting such power. The images of her beloved friends and mentors suffering torment at her own hands served as a brutal reminder that the power Falca offered came with corruption that would transform the user into the very thing she sought to oppose, creating a cycle of violence and hatred that would ultimately consume everything she valued most in life. The sight of Geralt, Yennefer, and the others burning in flames of her own creation, shocked Ciri into recognition of the true nature of the choice that lay before her. The rejection of Falca's offer required a strength of character that few individuals possessed, as Ciri was forced to turn away from power that could have solved all of her immediate problems in favor of maintaining the integrity of her own soul. The decision to renounce the magical abilities that had just saved Little Horse's life represented the ultimate act of self-sacrifice, as she chose powerlessness and vulnerability over corruption and domination. The rain that began to fall as Ciri collapsed in exhaustion served as both blessing and benediction, washing away the supernatural fires, while simultaneously providing the first relief from the desert's heat that she had experienced since her arrival in this hostile realm. The droplets that struck her face carried with them the promise that her sacrifice had been witnessed and approved by forces whose understanding transcended mortal comprehension, yet they also marked the beginning of a new phase of vulnerability that would test her resolve in entirely different ways. The departure of the unicorn herd that had gathered to witness her confrontation with Falca's spirit left Ciri more alone than ever before, as even Little Horse abandoned her once it became clear that she no longer possessed the power to protect him from the various threats that stalked the desert. The magical abilities that had briefly made her a valuable ally had been the foundation of their relationship, and without them she represented nothing more than a burden that could endanger his survival. The horseman who discovered her unconscious form beside the dying embers of her supernatural fire represented the nadir of her fortunes, as she found herself claimed by individuals whose cruelty and depravity exceeded even the monsters she had faced in the wilderness. The trappers who dragged her from the sand were human only in the most technical sense, their souls having been corrupted by greed and violence to the point where they retained no trace of the compassion or mercy that distinguished civilization from barbarism. The leader of this band of cutthroats wore armor decorated with the wings of a great bird of prey, his helmet serving as a mocking echo of the terror that Kahir's similar headgear had once inspired in her nightmares. Yet, where the young Nilfgaardian had ultimately revealed himself to be fundamentally decent despite his frightening appearance, this new captor radiated a malevolence that left no doubt about his willingness to commit any atrocity that might serve his purposes. The journey that followed represented a descent into depths of human degradation that challenged Ciri's fundamental understanding of morality and justice, as she was forced to witness acts of casual cruelty and systematic brutality that revealed the true nature of those who preyed upon the innocent for profit and pleasure. The casual manner in which her captors discussed her eventual fate made it clear that they viewed her not as a human being deserving of basic dignity, but as valuable merchandise to be delivered to their employer in whatever condition might prove most profitable. The death of the Nilfgaardian officer who had been hired to escort her to Emperor Emhyr's court removed the last restraint upon the trapper's behavior, leaving Ciri at the mercy of individuals who recognized no law beyond their own appetites and desires. The duel that claimed both Nilfgaardian knights transformed what should have been a relatively civilized transaction into an opportunity for unlimited exploitation and abuse by men whose fundamental nature had been revealed by the absence of external authority. The tavern where the trappers chose to celebrate their good fortune in acquiring such valuable prey served as a gathering place for the worst elements of frontier society, attracting criminals and degenerates whose presence created an atmosphere of barely contained violence and depravity that poisoned the very air with its malevolence. Here, surrounded by individuals who viewed human suffering as entertainment and cruelty as a legitimate source of pleasure, Ciri confronted the absolute depths of moral corruption that supposedly civilized beings could achieve. The boy called Kaylee, who found himself chained beside her, represented both salvation and damnation, as his membership in the notorious Rats gang offered the possibility of rescue from her current predicament, while simultaneously threatening to drag her into a life of criminality and violence that would complete the corruption of her soul. That Falca's power had begun. The choice between immediate death at the hands of the trappers and uncertain survival among thieves and murderers was hardly a choice at all. Yet it would ultimately determine the direction of her life for years to come. The rescue that erupted through the tavern's windows came with a violence and brutality that shocked even Ciri's traumatized sensibilities, as the rats demonstrated the same casual disregard for human life that had characterized their captors, while simultaneously revealing a code of loyalty and mutual protection that elevated them slightly above the level of mere predators. The speed and efficiency with which they eliminated the trappers spoke to hard-won experience in deadly combat, while their willingness to accept Ciri into their ranks revealed a recognition of potential that she herself did not yet understand. The blood that stained the tavern floor when the fighting ended represented both liberation and damnation, as Ciri's rescue from immediate death came at the cost of entry into a world where violence was the ultimate arbiter of all disputes, and where survival required the abandonment of moral principles that she had been taught to consider fundamental to human civilization. The sword that the rats placed in her hands carried with it not merely the means of self-defense, but the obligation to use it against other human beings in pursuit of goals that served no purpose beyond immediate gratification. The moment when Ciri first took human life marked a fundamental transformation in her character that could never be undone or forgotten, as the act of killing another person created changes in her soul that would influence every subsequent decision and relationship for the remainder of her existence. The nausea and horror that followed her first kill would fade with time and repetition, yet the essential humanity that made such reactions possible would be gradually eroded by the necessities of survival in a world that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. The name she chose for herself among the rats reflected her acceptance of the corruption that circumstances had forced upon her, as Falca's legacy claimed her not through supernatural temptation but through the inexorable logic of survival in a world that offered no alternatives to violence and predation. The young woman who had once been Princess Ciri of Sintra was dead, replaced by someone whose very existence was defined by the rejection of everything she had once held sacred and the embrace of principles that would have horrified her former self. The life that Ciri embraced among the rats was one of deliberate rebellion against every principle and value that had been instilled in her during her noble upbringing, as she threw herself into a world of violence and criminality, with the desperate intensity of someone seeking to escape from memories too painful to bear. The gang that had rescued her from the trappers operated according to codes that inverted traditional notions of honor and justice, creating a twisted mirror image of knightly ideals where loyalty was earned through shared criminality rather than noble deeds. The band itself consisted of individuals whose youth masked depths of corruption and moral decay that would have shocked those who still believed in the possibility of human redemption, each member having been shaped by circumstances that had stripped away their capacity for genuine empathy or concern for innocent suffering. They moved through the world like a pack of predators whose hunting instincts had been refined by years of successful violence, their camaraderie built upon mutual recognition of shared corruption rather than any positive bonds of affection or respect. Kaylee, the boy who had been instrumental in her rescue, represented the closest thing to leadership that the group possessed, though his authority was based more on cunning and ruthlessness than on any legitimate claim to command others. His youth and attractive features masked a mind that had been thoroughly corrupted by exposure to violence and degradation from an early age, creating someone who could commit the most heinous acts while maintaining a facade of boyish charm that made him particularly dangerous to those who underestimated his capacity for cruelty. Missile, the only other female member of the group, would prove to be both Ciri's salvation and her damnation, offering companionship and understanding in a world where both had become precious commodities while simultaneously serving as the architect of her moral downfall. The relationship that developed between them was complex and deeply troubling, built upon foundations of shared trauma and mutual dependence that created bonds stronger than love, but far more destructive than hatred. The first night that Ciri spent among the rats established patterns of behavior and expectation that would define her existence for the months that followed, as she learned that survival in their world required the abandonment of personal boundaries and the acceptance of treatment that no civilized society would tolerate. The violation that she endured at Missel's hands, under the guise of protection and affection, would create psychological wounds that would never fully heal, while simultaneously establishing the twisted dynamic that would characterize their relationship. The crimes that the rats committed were not motivated by any grand political purpose or even simple material need, but rather by a combination of boredom and malicious pleasure that revealed the depths to which human nature could sink when freed from the constraints of law and morality. Their attacks on merchant caravans and isolated settlements were exercises in gratuitous cruelty that served no purpose beyond the satisfaction of their own violent impulses and the accumulation of wealth that they squandered as quickly as they acquired it. Ciri's transformation from victim to willing participant in these atrocities was gradual but inexorable, as the psychological defense mechanisms that allowed her to survive in this environment gradually eroded her capacity to distinguish between necessary self-protection and voluntary evil. The first merchant she killed died under circumstances that could arguably be justified as self-defense, yet each subsequent act of violence made the next one easier until killing became as natural to her as breathing. The skills she had learned at Kaer Morhen proved devastatingly effective when applied to criminal purposes, as the Witcher training that had been designed to protect innocent lives was perverted into techniques for taking them more efficiently. The sword work that should have made her a champion of justice instead transformed her into one of the most feared killers in the region, her reputation growing with each successful raid, until her name was whispered in terror by those who traveled the dangerous roads where the rats hunted. The intoxication that came with the exercise of absolute power over life and death was unlike anything Ciri had previously experienced, providing a sense of control and mastery that served as a drug against the helplessness and trauma that had defined her recent experiences. The ability to inspire fear in others offered a twisted form of empowerment that compensated for the powerlessness she had felt during her captivity, yet it also accelerated her descent into moral corruption. The relationship that developed between Ciri and Missel was built upon foundations so complex and psychologically twisted that it defied simple categorization, combining elements of genuine affection with patterns of abuse and manipulation that created emotional bonds stronger than love yet infinitely more destructive. The older girl's protection of Ciri from the predatory intentions of their male companions came at the cost of claiming similar privileges for herself, establishing a dynamic that transformed rescue into another form of captivity. The physical intimacy that grew between them provided both women with comfort and companionship in a world where both had become dangerous luxuries, yet it also served to normalize patterns of behavior that would have been recognized as abusive in any healthier environment. The love that Ciri eventually felt for Missel was genuine and deep, yet it was also the love of a prisoner for her most benevolent captor, built upon psychological dependence rather than free choice. The months that Ciri spent traveling with the rats took her across vast stretches of countryside where the breakdown of law and order had created opportunities for those willing to exploit the suffering of others. Their raids becoming increasingly ambitious and violent as their reputation for successful brutality attracted both imitators and challengers who sought to claim their territory through superior force. The landscape through which they moved bore the scars of constant warfare and social collapse, its abandoned villages and burned farmsteads serving as monuments to humanity's capacity for self-destruction. The wealth that flowed through their hands from successful raids was squandered with the same casual disregard for consequence that characterized all of their other activities, as the rats lived entirely in the present moment, without consideration for future needs or the sustainability of their lifestyle. Gold that could have purchased security and comfort was instead spent on temporary pleasures and expensive drugs that provided brief escapes from the psychological toll of their criminal activities. The fistek that became an increasingly important part of their daily routine offered chemical relief from guilt and trauma, while simultaneously creating new forms of dependence and vulnerability that their enemies could exploit. The powder that they inhaled before raids provided artificial courage and dulled moral sensitivity, making it easier to commit acts that would have been impossible for their unaltered consciousnesses to contemplate. Yet, it also left them increasingly unable to function without chemical assistance. The tattoos that marked their bodies served as permanent reminders of their allegiance to principles that inverted traditional notions of honor and virtue, each design carrying specific meanings within the criminal underworld, while simultaneously serving as brands that marked them as permanent outsiders from civilized society. The rose that Ciri had carved into her own flesh matched the one that Missel bore, creating a physical symbol of their bond that could never be erased or forgotten. The mistake that would ultimately lead to their destruction came during what should have been a routine robbery of a merchant caravan that had been selected specifically because it appeared to offer valuable cargo with minimal risk of serious resistance. The young daughter of Baron Cassaday, who traveled with this particular group of traders, represented exactly the sort of collateral victim that the rats normally avoided harming, as attacking members of noble families inevitably brought down retribution that exceeded any possible material gain. Ciri's demand for the girl's brooch was motivated not by its monetary value, but by a complex mixture of jealousy and resentment that reflected her own lost innocence and abandoned nobility, as the sight of someone who still possessed the security and protection that had once been her birthright triggered emotional responses that overwhelmed her better judgment. The cruelty she displayed toward this innocent victim revealed the depths of corruption that her experiences had created within her soul. The Baron's response to his daughter's traumatic encounter with the notorious rats was everything that veteran criminals had learned to fear most, as his wealth and political connections allowed him to mobilize resources for vengeance that far exceeded the normal reach of local law enforcement. The bounty hunters he hired represented the most skilled and ruthless individuals in their profession, men whose dedication to their craft was matched only by their complete lack of mercy for those who fell within their crosshairs. Leo Bonhart's reputation preceded him like a shadow of death wherever he traveled, his name spoken in whispers by criminals and law-abiding citizens alike as someone whose pursuit was as inexorable as fate itself and whose methods transcended conventional notions of justice or restraint. The bounty hunter, who had made a career of tracking down the most dangerous outlaws in the known world, approached his profession with the cold efficiency of a master craftsman whose pride in his work extended to ensuring that his victims understood exactly who had brought about their downfall. The intelligence network that allowed Bonhart to track his prey across vast distances and through the most carefully planned attempts at concealment was built upon decades of cultivated contacts and hard-won reputation for both success and generous payment to those who provided useful information. His ability to anticipate the movements and decisions of his targets reflected not supernatural insight, but rather a deep understanding of criminal psychology, combined with meticulous attention to the sort of details that lesser hunters overlooked. The warning that reached the rats through Hotspawn's seemingly casual conversation was both accurate and deliberately provocative, designed to flush them into the open, where Bonhart could engage them on ground of his choosing, rather than forcing him to track them through territory that favored their guerrilla tactics. The bounty hunter's manipulation of information flow demonstrated the sophistication of his methods, as he used the criminals' own networks against them while maintaining the illusion that his intelligence came from chance encounters rather than careful planning. Ciri's decision to follow Hotspawn, despite the obvious risks, reflected both her growing restlessness with the limitations of life among the rats and her desire to confront the lies being spread about her supposed marriage to Emperor Emhyr, though her motives were complicated by emotions and impulses that she herself did not fully understand. The journey with the handsome spy represented a brief return to the sort of sophisticated adult company she had known in her former life, yet it also revealed how thoroughly her experiences had changed her fundamental approach to human relationships. The sexual encounter that almost took place between them illustrated the profound damage that Ciri's traumatic experiences had inflicted upon her ability to form healthy, intimate connections, as her confusion about desire and consent reflected the twisted lessons she had learned during her time with the rats. The fact that only Hotspawn's inconvenient death prevented their coupling demonstrated how completely her understanding of sexuality had been warped by exposure to relationships built upon power and exploitation rather than mutual respect and genuine affection. The magical horse, Kelpie, that became her companion following Hotspawn's demise, represented both liberation and temptation, as its supernatural abilities offered her opportunities for independence, while its unpredictable nature created new forms of danger that tested her skills and judgment in ways that ordinary mounts never could. The creature's willingness to serve her, despite its obviously wild and potentially dangerous nature, suggested recognition of something in her character that transcended normal human-animal relationships. The desperate ride toward jealousy that concluded this phase of Ciri's criminal career was motivated by genuine love for Missel and concern for her fellow rats, emotions that demonstrated the survival of her capacity for positive human feelings despite all the corruption and trauma she had endured. Yet this final gesture of loyalty to her criminal family would prove to be both too late and ultimately futile, as the trap that Bonhart had prepared was too carefully planned and expertly executed to be defeated by speed or desperation alone. The massacre that greeted Ciri's arrival at the tavern represented the brutal end of the rats as a criminal organization and the beginning of a new phase of her existence that would test her survival instincts in ways that even her time among outlaws had not prepared her to face. The sight of Missel's dying body surrounded by the corpses of their companions served as a grim reminder that even the most violent and seemingly invincible predators eventually became prey to others who possessed superior skills or better planning. The helplessness that Ciri felt as she watched Missel's life ebb away in that blood-soaked tavern was perhaps the most devastating emotion she had experienced since the fall of Sintra, as she was forced to confront the reality that all of her hard-won skills and accumulated power meant nothing in the face of an enemy who had planned his assault with the methodical precision of a master strategist. The love she felt for the dying girl was genuine and profound, yet it was also the love of someone whose capacity for healthy relationships had been fundamentally damaged by trauma and corrupted by exposure to patterns of abuse that she had internalized as normal. The capture that followed marked the beginning of the darkest period of Ciri's entire life, as she found herself in the hands of someone whose cruelty and methodical approach to inflicting suffering exceeded even the casual brutality she had witnessed among the rats. Leo Bonhart's treatment of his prize prisoner would demonstrate that there were depths of human evil that her criminal companions had never approached. Despite their own thorough corruption and disregard for civilized values, the ordeal that began with Ciri's capture by Leo Bonhart represented a descent into depths of human cruelty that challenged her fundamental understanding of what civilized beings were capable of inflicting upon one another, as she discovered that even her experiences among the rats had not prepared her for systematic torture administered by someone who approached the infliction of suffering with the cold precision of a master craftsman perfecting his art. The bounty hunter who had claimed her as his prize possessed a reputation built upon decades of successful hunts and methodical brutality that had earned him both fear and grudging respect from those who operated in the criminal underworld. Bonhart's initial treatment of his captive was designed not merely to establish dominance, but to break down the psychological defenses that had allowed her to survive her previous ordeals. As he understood that controlling someone of Ciri's demonstrated resilience required more than simple physical restraint or conventional intimidation, the collar that he fastened around her neck served multiple purposes beyond mere humiliation, functioning as both a practical means of control and a psychological tool that transformed her from a person into property in the eyes of all who witnessed her degradation. The public nature of her humiliation was calculated to strip away not only her dignity, but also any lingering sense of connection to her former identity as nobility. As Bonhart paraded her through towns and settlements, where the sight of a collared princess provided entertainment for audiences whose capacity for empathy had been eroded by exposure to constant violence and social breakdown. The jeers and mockery that followed her passage served as constant reminders that her fall from grace was complete and irreversible in the eyes of a world that valued power above all other considerations. The beatings that punctuated this journey were administered with scientific precision rather than emotional rage, as Bonhart's experience with breaking difficult captives had taught him exactly how much pain could be inflicted without causing permanent damage that might reduce his prisoner's value to potential buyers. Each blow was calculated to maximize suffering while preserving the physical integrity that made her a valuable commodity in markets, where such considerations determined pricing and desirability. The psychological warfare that accompanied these physical assaults was even more devastating than the pain itself, as Bonhart's casual discussions of her eventual fate were designed to create anticipation and dread that would erode her mental resilience more effectively than any amount of immediate torture. His descriptions of the various buyers who had expressed interest in acquiring her services painted pictures of futures so horrifying that death began to seem like a merciful alternative to continued existence. The sword that Bonhart purchased for her in the weapons markets of Fano was both gift and curse, its extraordinary beauty and obvious quality serving as mockery of her reduced circumstances, while simultaneously representing the first step in his plan to exploit her witcher training for his own profit and amusement. The blade called Zirael was a masterpiece of the swordsmith's art, its steel gleaming with the cold perfection that marked weapons designed for the hands of masters rather than mere soldiers or common criminals. The name engraved upon the crossguard meant swallow in the ancient tongue, carrying connotations of freedom and flight that provided bitter irony for someone whose wings had been clipped by circumstances beyond her control. The weapon's balance and responsiveness suggested it had been crafted specifically for her hands, though the mysterious circumstances of its acquisition and the weaponsmith's refusal to accept payment hinted at forces operating beyond the normal boundaries of commercial transaction. The journey to Claremont that followed her acquisition of Ziriel represented Bonhart's growing confidence in his ability to control and exploit his prize. As he prepared to unveil her abilities to audiences who would pay premium prices to witness the spectacle of a fallen princess, forced to fight for the entertainment of those who had never known nobility themselves. The arena that awaited them was a monument to humanity's appetite for violence transformed into entertainment, its blood-soaked sands having witnessed countless deaths performed for the pleasure of crowds whose bloodlust had been refined by exposure to ever more elaborate forms of cruelty. Huvernagel, the disgusting little man who managed this temple of degradation, represented everything that was worst about those who profited from human suffering while maintaining the pretense of legitimate business. His obsequious manner toward Bonhart barely concealed the calculating greed that motivated his every interaction, as he assessed Ciri's potential value with the same cold precision that a livestock dealer might use to evaluate breeding stock at market. The drugs that they forced into her system before her first fight were designed to enhance her reflexes and dull her moral sensitivity, creating a chemical cocktail that would make her more effective as a killer while reducing her capacity to feel remorse for the lives she was about to take. The fistek that burned through her nostrils carried with it not only artificial courage, but also the beginning of a chemical dependence that would make her more compliant and easier to control in the long term. The arena itself was a carefully designed killing ground, where every element had been calculated to maximize the entertainment value of mortal combat, while ensuring that the outcomes remained sufficiently unpredictable to maintain audience interest and encourage gambling. The sand that covered the floor had been treated with substances that would absorb blood without becoming slippery, while the walls were positioned to prevent easy escape, while still allowing spectators clear views of the carnage below. The opponents who faced Ciri in this hellish colosseum were themselves victims of circumstances that had reduced them to the level of expendable entertainment, their desperation and fear making them dangerous in ways that trained soldiers might not have been. Each fight became a test not only of her physical abilities, but also of her willingness to kill other human beings for the amusement of audiences whose applause was purchased with blood and suffering. The first man who died on her blade fell with a look of surprise that would haunt Ciri's dreams for years to come, his expression revealing the moment when he realized that his opponent possessed skills that far exceeded anything he had been prepared to face. The ease with which Zirael parted his flesh and found his heart demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Witcher training when applied without the moral constraints that normally governed its use. The victories that followed came with increasing mechanical precision, as Ciri learned to suppress the emotional responses that made killing traumatic and instead approached each bout with the cold calculation that her survival demanded. The crowds that cheered her successes were purchasing not merely entertainment, but the systematic destruction of whatever remained of her humanity, their bloodlust feeding on the corruption of innocence in ways that satisfied psychological needs deeper than mere voyeuristic pleasure. The attempt at suicide that marked the nadir of her captivity was motivated not by cowardice, but by the recognition that death might represent the only escape from a life that had become indistinguishable from the most creative forms of damnation. The blade that she turned upon herself in that moment of ultimate despair was the same one that had brought death to so many others, its edge now offering the promise of release from suffering that had exceeded her capacity to endure. Yet even this final gesture of defiance was denied to her, as Bonhart's vigilance and experience with managing desperate captives allowed him to intervene before her resolve could overcome the natural human instinct for self-preservation. The punishment that followed was designed not merely to inflict pain, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance and the completeness of his control over every aspect of her existence. The flogging that took place in the cellar beneath the arena was administered with the same methodical precision that characterized all of Bonhart's actions, each stroke calculated to maximize pain while avoiding damage that might reduce her effectiveness in future fights. The leather that tore her flesh had been treated with substances that would ensure the wounds healed slowly and with maximum discomfort, creating lasting reminders of the consequences of disobedience. The threats regarding her teeth represented a particularly cruel form of psychological torture, as Bonhart understood that the prospect of permanent disfigurement carried implications that went beyond mere physical pain to touch upon fundamental aspects of identity and self-worth. The detailed descriptions of the procedures he intended to employ were delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing routine maintenance rather than deliberate mutilation, their matter-of-fact delivery making them even more terrifying than angry threats might have been. The town of Unicorn that served as the venue for Bonhart's meeting with his various employers provided a perfect setting for the sort of clandestine negotiations that determined the fates of valuable prisoners and strategic assets. Its reputation as a place where any service could be purchased and any crime overlooked, making it a natural gathering point for those whose business required absolute discretion. The very name of the settlement carried bitter irony for someone who had once been blessed by the friendship of such creatures, serving as a reminder of innocence lost and purity corrupted. The humiliation of being tied to a post in the town square while negotiations proceeded around her was designed to reinforce her status as property rather than person, while simultaneously providing entertainment for local residents, whose lives contained little enough diversion that the spectacle of a fallen princess drew crowds of curious onlookers. The jeers and crude comments that accompanied this public display served as constant reminders that she had fallen so far from her original station that she was now regarded as nothing more than an object of amusement. Rience's presence at these negotiations represented the continuing interest of Vilgefortz and his faction in acquiring control over Ciri's person and abilities. Though the Fire Mage's obvious sadistic pleasure in her reduced circumstances suggested that his motivations extended beyond mere strategic considerations to encompass personal gratification derived from witnessing her suffering. The scars that marked his own face served as reminders of previous encounters with forces beyond his ability to control, yet they had apparently taught him nothing about the dangers of underestimating his opponents. Stefan Skellen's participation in the discussions revealed the complex web of competing interests that surrounded Ciri's fate, as various factions sought to acquire her for purposes that ranged from political manipulation to magical experimentation, to simple revenge against those who had thwarted their previous plans. The negotiations that determined her future took place entirely without her input or consent, reducing her to the status of valuable merchandise whose preferences were irrelevant to the transaction. The psychic named Kenna, who attempted to probe Ciri's mind during these proceedings, represented the first genuine threat to the mental defenses that she had constructed to protect her sanity from the worst aspects of her captivity, as the woman's abilities offered the possibility of exposing thoughts and memories that Ciri desperately needed to keep hidden. The resistance that she was able to mount against this invasion demonstrated that some aspects of her power remained intact despite her apparent helplessness in other areas. The unexpected reawakening of her magical abilities that resulted from Kenna's probe provided Ciri with the first real hope she had experienced since her capture, as the return of her supernatural capabilities offered possibilities for escape that simple physical prowess could never have achieved. The violence that erupted from her renewed powers was both liberating and terrifying, demonstrating that the forces that flowed through her bloodline operated according to principles that transcended normal human limitations. The guards who fell before her restored abilities never had a chance to understand what was happening to them, as energies that operated beyond mortal comprehension tore through their bodies with the devastating efficiency that characterized all applications of the Elder Blood when properly channeled. Their deaths were neither quick nor merciful, serving as demonstrations of the terrible price that could be exacted by those who underestimated the true nature of their prisoner. Neratin Shaker's intervention on her behalf revealed the presence of forces and loyalties that operated beyond the immediate sphere of her captor's influence, as the spy's willingness to sacrifice their own life to ensure her escape demonstrated that not all who served various political factions had abandoned basic human decency in pursuit of their goals. The courage required to challenge someone of Bonhart's reputation and abilities spoke to convictions that transcended mere professional duty. The desperate flight on Kelpie that followed her liberation represented both triumph and tragedy, as her escape from immediate danger came at the cost of lives that had been sacrificed to ensure her freedom, while the injury inflicted by Skellen's throwing star served as a permanent reminder of how close she had come to remaining in captivity forever. The scar that would mark her face for the remainder of her life carried with it not only physical disfigurement, but also psychological significance as a symbol of survival against impossible odds. The winter landscape through which she fled was transformed into a battlefield where her pursuers would face terrain and conditions that favored her natural advantages while negating many of their numerical and organizational superiorities, as the frozen lakes and snow-covered forests provided opportunities for someone with her skills and determination to turn the tables on enemies who had underestimated her resourcefulness. The ice skates that she had carried with her since leaving Visogota's cottage would prove to be the key to a victory that would finally free her from the nightmare of Bonhart's control. The trap that she set on the frozen lake was simple in conception but devastating in execution, as her ability to move across the ice with grace and speed that her pursuers could not match transformed what should have been a hopeless confrontation into a massacre that eliminated most of her enemies while leaving her free to deal with the remainder, on terms that favored her survival. The red stains that marked her passage across the white ice served as vivid testimony to both her recovered abilities and her willingness to use them without mercy or restraint. Rience's death was particularly satisfying, as the fire mage, who had taken such pleasure in others' suffering, discovered that his own abilities were useless against someone who could approach him with impunity across terrain where he could find no secure footing. The mutilation that Ciri inflicted upon him before allowing him to drown represented not merely practical elimination of a threat, but also personal revenge for the humiliations and torments he had helped to devise during her captivity. The confrontation with Bonhart that concluded this phase of her ordeal was anticlimactic in some ways, as the legendary bounty hunter found himself outmaneuvered by supernatural forces that operated beyond his ability to predict or counter, while the appearance of Tor Zirael demonstrated that powers greater than any mortal agency had been working to ensure her ultimate escape from his control. The fog that concealed the tower's manifestation served as fitting metaphor for the mysterious forces that continued to shape her destiny in ways that remained beyond ordinary understanding. The tower itself stood as a gateway between worlds and possibilities, its ancient stones bearing witness to powers that had existed since the dawn of creation, and would continue to operate long after the current age had passed into legend and myth. The threshold that Ciri crossed as she entered its mysterious portal represented not merely escape from immediate danger, but transition into realms where entirely different rules and principles would govern her continued existence and ultimate fate. The realm that welcomed Ciri through the dimensional gateway of Tor Zirael was one of such breathtaking beauty and apparent tranquility that it seemed designed specifically to heal the wounds that mortal existence had inflicted upon her battered soul, its crystalline streams and flower-laden meadows, creating an atmosphere of peace and harmony that stood in stark contrast to the violence and suffering that had defined her recent experiences. Yet beneath this facade of paradise lay currents of ancient power and carefully concealed malevolence that would soon reveal themselves as more dangerous than any earthly threat she had previously faced. The figure who awaited her arrival in this deceptively peaceful glade possessed the timeless beauty and ethereal grace that marked him as one of the ANL, those ancient elves whose mastery of magical arts had elevated them beyond the limitations that constrained their younger cousins, who still dwelt in the mortal realm. Avalach's appearance combined masculine strength with the delicate features that characterized his race, while his eyes held depths of knowledge and experience that spoke of lifespans measured in centuries rather than the brief decades allotted to human existence. His greeting carried the elaborate courtesy that the Ain-El had refined over millennia of sophisticated civilization, yet beneath its polished surface lay currents of calculation and purpose that suggested this meeting was neither accidental nor motivated by simple benevolence toward a refugee from dimensional chaos. The shelter and comfort that he offered came with obligations and expectations that would only gradually become apparent as Ciri learned more about the nature of her supposed benefactors. The dwelling to which Avalach conducted her represented the pinnacle of elven architectural achievement, its graceful lines and organic curves seeming to grow naturally from the landscape itself, while incorporating materials and techniques that transcended anything achievable by mortal craftsmen. Every element of its design served both practical and aesthetic purposes, creating an environment that nurtured both body and spirit, while simultaneously demonstrating the advanced civilization of those who had created it. The revelations that gradually emerged during their conversations painted a picture of cosmic significance that placed Ciri's personal struggles within a context far grander and more terrible than anything she had previously imagined. As Avalach explained the true nature of her bloodline and the forces that had been manipulating events across multiple worlds to bring about her arrival in this distant realm, the elder blood that flowed through her veins was not merely a source of magical power, but the culmination of breeding programs that had spanned generations and transcended the boundaries between species. Her ancestor Lara Doran had been the product of careful genetic manipulation designed to replicate the natural abilities of unicorns, those legendary beings whose mastery of dimensional travel had made them invaluable allies and equally dangerous enemies to those who sought to expand their influence beyond the confines of single worlds. The love affair between this specially crafted elven maiden and a human mage had been viewed as both betrayal and contamination by the Ain-El, who considered their carefully bred bloodline to be too precious for dilution with inferior genetic material. The children born from this union had been hunted and persecuted by elven agents who sought to either reclaim or destroy the stolen heritage that they carried within their veins. Yet the power that made them valuable also made them resilient, allowing the bloodline to survive through centuries of persecution, while growing stronger with each passing generation. Ciri represented the culmination of this long process, carrying within her genetic structure the potential for abilities that exceeded even those of her legendary ancestor. The Ain-El's interest in her was motivated not by sentiment or family loyalty, but by practical considerations that reduced her to the status of valuable breeding stock, whose offspring might provide solutions to problems that had plagued their civilization for millennia. Their mastery of dimensional magic had once allowed them to conquer and exploit countless worlds, spreading their influence across vast reaches of space and time. through the use of portals that could transport entire armies from one reality to another. Yet this golden age of expansion and conquest had ended abruptly when the unicorns, disgusted by the Ainel's brutality and exploitation of conquered peoples, had withdrawn their cooperation and sealed the great portals that had made interdimensional travel possible. The elves found themselves trapped within a single world, their vast ambitions constrained by limitations that their technology could not overcome without the willing assistance of creatures who now regarded them as enemies rather than allies. The plan that had brought Ciri to their realm was elegantly simple in conception yet monstrous in its implications, as the Ainel intended to use her unique heritage to create a new generation of beings who could command the powers of dimensional travel without requiring the cooperation of unicorns or other magical creatures. The child that they hoped she would bear would represent the synthesis of elven knowledge and elder blood potential, creating a hybrid whose abilities would restore their capacity for interdimensional conquest. King Oberon Muirsetach, the ancient ruler of the Ainel, embodied both the greatness and the decay that characterized his people's current circumstances, his regal bearing and obvious intelligence marred by the weariness and cynicism that came from outliving most of his hopes and dreams. The centuries of his reign had been marked by gradual decline from the heights of power and influence that his predecessors had enjoyed, leaving him to preside over a civilization that retained all of its cultural sophistication while losing the dynamism that had once made it a force to be reckoned with across multiple dimensions. The philosophical discussions that occupied their time together revealed depths of learning and wisdom that human scholars could barely comprehend. Yet, they also demonstrated the fundamental disconnect between elven and human perspectives on questions of morality and individual rights. Where Ciri saw herself as a person with inherent dignity and the right to determine her own fate, Oberon viewed her as a valuable resource whose potential could be harnessed for the greater good of elven civilization. The physical relationship that the king attempted to establish with his unwilling guest proved to be complicated by factors that neither party had anticipated, as the vast differences in their ages and cultural backgrounds created barriers to intimacy that could not be overcome through royal decree or philosophical argument. The mechanical nature of their encounters reflected the absence of genuine emotional connection between individuals whose fundamental values and life experiences had no common ground. Oberon's inability to perform the biological functions necessary for procreation was both humiliating and frustrating. For someone whose entire identity had been built upon the assumption of royal prerogative and absolute authority over lesser beings, the failure of their union to produce the desired offspring threatened not only his personal dignity, but also the grand strategy that represented the Ainel's best hope for reclaiming their former glory and power. Eredin Breac Glass, the ambitious general who commanded the Ainel's military forces, represented a younger and more aggressive approach to their civilization's problems, his impatience with traditional methods leading him to advocate for solutions that relied upon force and deception rather than diplomacy and persuasion. The wild hunt that he commanded was composed of the most skilled and ruthless warriors in elven society, their ability to travel between dimensions through sheer magical power, making them feared throughout multiple worlds. The aphrodisiac that Eredin offered as a solution to Oberon's performance difficulties was presented as a medical remedy for a temporary problem, yet its true nature as a poison designed to eliminate an obstacle to his own ambitions revealed the depths of treachery and calculation that characterized elven political maneuvering. The general's willingness to murder his own king demonstrated that even their supposedly superior civilization was subject to the same brutal power struggles that plagued human societies. The rides that Ciri took through the elven countryside provided her with opportunities to explore her prison, while simultaneously revealing the true nature of the world to which she had been transported. As the beauty and harmony that characterized the areas near Avalach's dwelling gave way to landscapes that told very different stories about elven civilization and its treatment of conquered peoples. The magical horse Kelpie, who had somehow followed her through dimensional barriers, served as both companion and means of escape when the constraints of her captivity became unbearable. The discovery of the stone circles where unicorns gathered represented a crucial turning point in Ciri's understanding of her situation, as these meetings provided her with direct contact with beings whose perspective on elven civilization differed radically from the carefully constructed narrative that her captors had presented. The unicorns who assembled in these sacred places carried with them the accumulated wisdom of ages spent observing the rise and fall of various civilizations across multiple dimensions. Little Horse, whose true name, Ihuaraquax, carried meanings that transcended simple linguistic translation, had followed her through trials and tribulations that would have broken the spirit of lesser beings. His devotion to her welfare, representing one of the few pure and selfless relationships that had survived all of the corruption and compromise that had marked her recent experiences. The reunion with her faithful companion brought both joy and terrible knowledge, as his warnings about the true nature of her captor's intentions could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding or prejudice. The revelations that the unicorn shared with her painted a picture of elven civilization that differed dramatically from the cultured and philosophical facade that Avalach and his associates had presented, revealing a history of conquest and exploitation that had left entire worlds stripped of resources and populations reduced to slavery or extinction. The bone fields that Ihuaraquax showed her represented only the most recent evidence of genocidal policies that the Ain El had pursued in their quest for dominance and expansion. The sight of countless human remains scattered across landscapes that had once supported thriving civilizations provided Ciri with undeniable proof that her captor's intentions were far more sinister than their polite conversation and philosophical discussions had suggested. The scale of the slaughter that these killing fields represented exceeded even the worst atrocities that she had witnessed in her own world, demonstrating that the capacity for evil was not limited to supposedly primitive human societies. The knowledge that she was intended to serve as the foundation for a breeding program designed to create new generations of interdimensional conquerors transformed her entire understanding of her situation from uncomfortable captivity to existential threat not only to herself, but to countless innocent beings across multiple worlds. The child that the Ain El hoped she would bear would be raised and trained to view other species as resources to be exploited rather than sentient beings deserving of respect and consideration. King Oberon's death came as both tragedy and liberation, as the old monarch's passing removed one obstacle to her escape, while simultaneously demonstrating the ruthless pragmatism that characterized elven politics at the highest levels. The aphrodisiac that Eredin had provided proved fatal to someone whose advanced age had made him vulnerable to substances that might have been harmless to younger individuals. Yet the general surprise at this outcome suggested that murder had not been his conscious intention. The genuine grief that Ciri felt for Oberon's death reflected her ability to recognize the fundamental decency that had existed beneath his alien cultural assumptions and moral blind spots, as she understood that his treatment of her had been motivated by what he sincerely believed to be necessity rather than simple cruelty or sadistic pleasure. The dignity with which he faced his final moments earned her respect even as she prepared to escape from the realm that his death would soon transform into a far more dangerous place for unwilling guests. The pursuit that followed her flight from the elven capital was led by Eredin himself, whose assumption of royal authority following Oberon's death gave him both the motivation and the resources necessary to prevent her escape at all costs. The wild hunt that he commanded represented the elite of elven military forces, their supernatural abilities and interdimensional mobility, making them perhaps the most dangerous opponents that Ciri had ever faced in direct confrontation. The running battle that carried her across the elven landscape tested every skill and ability that she had acquired during her training and adventures, as she found herself pitted against enemies whose centuries of experience and magical enhancement far exceeded anything that mortal opponents could offer. The supernatural endurance that allowed the Red Riders to pursue her without rest or respite created conditions where victory could only be achieved through escape rather than direct confrontation. The decision to use her Elder Blood abilities for interdimensional travel represented both triumph and tragedy, as the successful activation of powers that had remained largely dormant throughout her captivity came at the cost of abandoning Huaraquax to face enemies whose revenge upon him would be terrible beyond description. The sacrifice that her loyal companion made to ensure her freedom added another layer of guilt and sorrow to the emotional burdens that she carried, while simultaneously demonstrating the profound bonds that could exist between different species when based upon genuine affection rather than exploitation. The journey through multiple dimensions that followed her escape from the Ainel realm was both liberation and exile, as each portal that she opened carried her further from any possibility of returning to familiar places and people, while simultaneously offering new experiences and challenges that tested her adaptability and resilience in ways that no single world could have provided. The random nature of her interdimensional travels meant that each destination was a gamble with consequences that could not be predicted or controlled. The worlds through which she passed during this cosmic odyssey ranged from realms of incredible beauty and harmony to places of such horror and desolation that they challenged her sanity and will to survive, each offering lessons about the diversity of possible forms that civilization and barbarism could take when freed from the constraints that governed her original reality. Some dimensions contained societies that had achieved levels of technological and social development that exceeded anything in her experience, while others had devolved into chaos and degradation that made even her darkest memories seem pleasant by comparison. The plague that she inadvertently carried to one particular world served as a grim reminder that interdimensional travel could have consequences that extended far beyond the traveler's personal circumstances, as diseases and parasites that were harmless in their original environment could prove devastatingly lethal when introduced to populations that had no natural immunity or resistance. The knowledge that her passage might have caused the deaths of countless innocent beings added another burden of guilt to those she already carried. The encounter with the young sorceress Nimue represented one of the few positive relationships that emerged from this period of dimensional wandering, as the girl's genuine fascination with Ciri's story and abilities created a connection based upon mutual respect rather than exploitation or manipulation. The scholarly interest that Nimue displayed in documenting and understanding Ciri's experiences would prove to have significance that extended far beyond mere academic curiosity, as the research that she conducted would eventually provide the key to resolving crises that had not yet come to pass. The promise that Nimue made to help guide Ciri back to her original world represented hope for eventual reunion with those she had been forced to abandon. Yet it also carried the implication that such assistance would come at a time and under circumstances that remained beyond her control. The complex temporal mechanics that governed interdimensional travel meant that return journeys could not be precisely timed or targeted, leaving Ciri dependent upon forces and individuals whose own agendas might not align with her personal desires for reunion and revenge. The portal that finally carried her back toward her original dimension opened not in some place of safety or comfort, but directly into the heart of enemy territory, as the castle that served as Vilgefortz's stronghold materialized around her like a trap that had been waiting for years to finally spring shut upon its intended prey. The irony that her escape from elven captivity had delivered her directly into the hands of the sorcerer who had orchestrated so much of her suffering provided a bitter reminder that fate seemed determined to deny her any respite from the conflicts and challenges that had defined her existence. The castle that materialized around Ciri as she emerged from Nimwe's carefully guided portal was a monument to corruption and twisted ambition, its ancient stones bearing witness to centuries of dark experiments and forbidden research that had transformed what should have been a seat of learning and wisdom into something that seemed to exist at the intersection of nightmare and reality. Every corridor echoed with the accumulated suffering of countless victims who had been sacrificed upon the altar of Vilgefortz's insatiable hunger for knowledge and power, their anguish having soaked so deeply into the very foundations that the structure itself seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. The sorcerer, who had orchestrated so much of the tragedy that had befallen her family and kingdom, awaited her arrival with the calm satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were finally approaching their intended culmination. His appearance unchanged by the years that had passed since their last encounter, despite the vast scope of the schemes he had pursued during her absence. The power that radiated from his presence was both terrible and seductive, representing the ultimate corruption of gifts that should have been used to protect and heal rather than dominate and destroy. Vilgefortz's greeting carried all the mock courtesy that characterized his every interaction with those he considered his intellectual inferiors, his words designed to demonstrate his superiority, while simultaneously revealing the depths of contempt he felt for anyone whose abilities or achievements fell short of his own extraordinary standards. The casual manner in which he discussed her capture and intended fate spoke to a mindset that had moved so far beyond normal human empathy that other people had become nothing more than resources to be exploited in pursuit of his grand designs. The chamber to which he conducted her was a masterpiece of surgical precision and technological innovation, its gleaming instruments and carefully calibrated devices representing the pinnacle of magical and mundane science, working in harmonious synthesis to achieve goals that transcended the limitations of either discipline alone. Every element of its design served specific purposes in the procedures that he intended to perform, creating an environment where the boundaries between healing and violation had been deliberately obscured beyond recognition. The chair that dominated the center of this hellish laboratory was both throne and torture device, its restraints crafted from materials that could contain even someone possessing Ciri's supernatural abilities, while its various mechanical components served functions that she could only guess at with growing horror. The casual efficiency with which Vilgefortz described its capabilities spoke to years of experimentation and refinement that had been purchased with the suffering of victims whose names and faces had been forgotten in pursuit of technical perfection. The revelation of his true intentions stripped away any remaining illusions about the nature of her situation. As he explained with scientific detachment, his plans for artificial insemination, followed by the harvesting of placental material that contained the concentrated essence of elder blood in its most potent and accessible form. The procedures he described were violations that transcended mere physical assault to encompass forms of spiritual desecration that challenged the very foundations of what it meant to be human. The arrival of Geralt and his unlikely band of companions transformed the sterile horror of the laboratory into a battlefield where the accumulated grievances and conflicting loyalties of years finally erupted into open warfare, as the White Wolf's legendary prowess with blade and spell was matched against the full might of a sorcerer whose power had been amplified by decades of forbidden research and unholy experimentation. The violence that followed was both personal and cosmic in its implications, representing not merely a rescue attempt, but a confrontation between opposing philosophies about the proper use of supernatural abilities. Regis's dramatic entrance through the chamber's window brought with it all the terrible beauty and otherworldly grace that characterized the higher vampires. His transformation from cultured companion to instrument of divine retribution, demonstrating the awesome power that lay hidden beneath his civilized exterior. The sight of his true nature, unleashed upon Vilgefortz's minions, provided stark testimony to the wisdom of those ancient warnings about the dangers of provoking beings whose capabilities transcended mortal understanding. The vampire's gentle reassurance of Ciri carried with it the weight of oaths sworn in friendship and loyalty earned through shared trials, his presence serving as proof that even in the darkest circumstances, help could arrive from the most unexpected sources. The casual manner in which he dismembered the laboratory guards while speaking words of comfort demonstrated the duality that existed within all truly powerful beings, where capacity for both creation and destruction existed in perfect balance. Ciri's desperate concern for Yennefer's safety revealed the depth of the bonds that had formed between them during their time together. As the young woman who had learned to survive through self-reliance and emotional detachment found herself unable to abandon someone who had become more than mentor or guardian, but rather the closest thing to a mother that fate had allowed her to know. The willingness to risk her own freedom in pursuit of rescue demonstrated the survival of compassion and loyalty, despite all of the trauma and corruption that had threatened to destroy her capacity for positive human emotion. The encounters with both Cahir and Angoulême during her flight through the castle's corridors brought her face to face with individuals whose own journeys had been shaped by the same forces of destiny and circumstance that had driven her own transformation, creating moments of recognition and understanding that transcended the immediate urgency of their shared peril. The sacrifices that both companions made to ensure her safety added new layers of debt and obligation to those she already carried, while simultaneously demonstrating the power of redemption to transform even the most unlikely individuals into heroes worthy of song and story. Cahir's final moments carried with them all the weight of prophecy fulfilled and destiny embraced, as the young man who had once been the focus of her childhood nightmares revealed himself to be someone whose courage and devotion exceeded that of knights, whose names were celebrated in legend and ballad. The forgiveness that passed between them served to heal wounds that had festered for years, while simultaneously freeing both of them from the chains of past trauma that had bound their fates together in patterns of fear and misunderstanding. Angoulême's death was perhaps even more tragic for its casual heroism and matter-of-fact acceptance of sacrifice. As the former criminal who had found purpose and meaning through service to a cause greater than herself demonstrated that nobility was not a matter of birth or breeding, but rather a choice that could be made by anyone regardless of their serve, origins, or past mistakes. The tears that Ciri shed for these unlikely champions carried within them recognition of the profound bonds that could form between individuals united by shared purpose and mutual respect. The confrontation with Leo Bonhart that had been building since her escape from his custody finally reached its climax in circumstances that allowed for the sort of fair combat that his previous advantages in resources and allies had made impossible, creating conditions where skill and determination would be the only factors determining the outcome of their long-delayed reckoning. The arena of broken stone and flickering shadows that surrounded their duel provided a fitting backdrop for the settling of accounts that had been accumulating since the first moment of her captivity. The bounty hunter who had tormented her for so long proved to be every bit as dangerous in single combat as his reputation suggested. His decades of experience and natural talent, with weapons creating a formidable opponent whose every attack was calculated to exploit weaknesses, that his intimate knowledge of her abilities had revealed. The Witcher medallions that hung around his neck served as grim reminders of other champions who had fallen before his blade, their presence designed to undermine her confidence, while simultaneously demonstrating the deadly seriousness of their confrontation. The sword Ziriel sang with righteous fury as it met Bonhart's weapons in a dance of death that tested every skill and technique that Ciri had acquired during her years of training and hardship. The blade that had been forced to taste innocent blood in the arena, finally finding a target worthy of its true purpose, as an instrument of justice rather than mere entertainment. The balance and responsiveness that had made it such an effective tool for killing became assets in pursuit of legitimate vengeance rather than meaningless spectacle. The moment when Bonhart finally fell carried with it a satisfaction that transcended simple revenge to encompass something approaching spiritual catharsis, as the death of her tormentor represented not merely the elimination of a personal enemy, but the symbolic triumph of justice over cruelty and hope over despair. The medallions that she claimed from his corpse would serve as memorials to the witches he had murdered, while simultaneously providing her with connections to traditions and values that her experiences had nearly caused her to abandon. The victory over Vilgefortz that Geralt and Yennefer achieved through their combined efforts represented the culmination of years of preparation and accumulated grievances, as the sorcerer's hubris and overconfidence in his own superiority finally met forces that could match his power, while exceeding his understanding of what truly motivated exceptional individuals to transcend their apparent limitations. The collapse of his schemes and the destruction of his laboratory served as fitting monuments to the ultimate futility of attempting to reduce other people to mere instruments in service of personal ambition. Yet even these triumphs could not prevent the final confrontation that had been building toward inevitability since the moment of Ciri's birth. As Emperor Emhyr var Emreis arrived, with forces sufficient to claim his daughter, regardless of any resistance that her protectors might offer, the sight of Nilfgaardian banners filling the castle's courtyards served as stark reminder that individual heroism, no matter how exceptional, remained subject to the harsh mathematics of political power and military superiority. The emperor who faced them in the castle's great hall was both stranger and family, his regal bearing and obvious intelligence making it impossible to dismiss him as a simple villain, while his stated intentions regarding his daughter created moral complexities that defied easy resolution. The years that had passed since his transformation from the cursed Dunny into the supreme ruler of the most powerful empire in the known world had refined his understanding of statecraft and political necessity without eliminating the fundamental humanity that had once made him capable of genuine love. The law of surprise that Geralt invoked as the foundation for his claim to Ciri's guardianship represented one of the few legal principles that even imperial authority was expected to recognize. Yet Emhyr's response made clear that his determination to fulfill what he considered his destiny transcended any obligation to respect traditional customs or ancient laws. The philosophical debate that might have resolved their competing claims was rendered meaningless by the presence of armed soldiers whose loyalty to their emperor exceeded any abstract commitment to justice or legal precedent. The farewell that Ciri shared with Geralt and Yennefer carried within it all the love and gratitude that she had never been able to express adequately during their time together, their whispered promises and desperate embraces serving as testament to bonds that transcended any relationship based merely upon duty or obligation. The knowledge that they might never see each other again transformed every word and gesture into something precious beyond measure, while their courage in the face of overwhelming odds provided her with strength that would sustain her through the trials ahead. The moment when Emhyr finally looked into his daughter's tear-streaked face and saw not a political asset or prophetic fulfillment, but simply a frightened young woman who had suffered more than anyone should be required to. Indure, the Emperor's carefully constructed rationales for his intended course of action, crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. The paternal instincts that he had suppressed in pursuit of what he considered greater purposes suddenly reasserted themselves with overwhelming force, creating internal conflicts that no amount of political calculation could resolve. The decision that he made in that moment of ultimate choice represented both personal redemption and the rejection of destinies that had seemed fixed by forces beyond mortal control. As the man who had commanded the loyalty of millions chose to defy prophecy itself, rather than inflict further suffering upon someone whose pain had already exceeded reasonable measure, the tears that flowed down his weathered cheeks served as evidence that even the most hardened rulers retained the capacity for mercy when confronted with the human cost of their ambitions. The freedom that Emher granted to his daughter came with the implicit understanding that their paths would likely never cross again, as the Emperor, who had rejected prophecy in favor of paternal love, understood that her safety required distance from the political forces that would always seek to exploit her unique heritage for their own purposes. The false Ciri who would serve as his empress represented a compromise that satisfied political necessities while protecting the real princess from futures that held only suffering and exploitation. The campaign of justice and vengeance that followed Ciri's liberation allowed her to confront the various individuals and institutions that had contributed to her suffering, creating opportunities for closure and healing that had been denied to her during years of powerlessness and victimization. The settlements that they visited on their journey of retribution had been touched by their various enemies in ways that demanded acknowledgement and redress, their suffering serving as testimony to the broader consequences of the schemes and ambitions that had shaped her own fate. The graves of the rats that she discovered in jealousy had been tended with care that spoke to recognition of their humanity despite their criminal activities, the flowers and stones that marked their resting places, serving as evidence that even the most degraded individuals could inspire affection and loyalty in those who knew them well. The tears that she shed at Missel's graveside carried within them both grief for what had been lost and gratitude for love that had existed despite the twisted circumstances of its origin. The arena that had been the site of so much suffering burned with flames that seemed to purge the very stones of accumulated anguish and cruelty, its destruction serving as both practical elimination of a source of evil and symbolic triumph of justice over exploitation. The smoke that rose from its ruins carried with it the prayers and curses of countless victims whose suffering had finally been acknowledged and avenged by those with the power to act upon righteous anger. The Lodge of Sorceresses, who summoned them to Monte Calvo, represented yet another faction whose interest in Ciri's future was motivated by political calculation rather than genuine concern for her welfare. Their elaborate plans for her marriage and motherhood, differing from those of other groups only in the specific details of how they intended to exploit her unique abilities. The demand for her presence at their gathering served as reminder that freedom from immediate danger did not necessarily mean freedom from the various forces that sought to control her destiny. Yet the reunion with Geralt that awaited her in Rivia would prove to be both joy and catastrophe, as the pogrom that erupted in that supposedly peaceful city demonstrated that the forces of hatred and prejudice could destroy even the most careful plans and hard-won happiness. The violence that consumed the streets was senseless and brutal, claiming innocent lives while settling no legitimate grievances and achieving no worthy goals beyond the satisfaction of mankind's capacity for cruelty toward those perceived as different or threatening. Geralt's death in that meaningless conflict represented the ultimate tragedy of a life devoted to protecting others from the very forces that ultimately claimed him. As the White Wolf, who had faced down monsters and sorcerers, fell to the hatred of ordinary people whose fear had been manipulated by those who profited from division and conflict. The sword that had carved legends from the stuff of nightmare proved useless against the simple brutality of a mob whose individual members lacked the courage to act alone but found deadly strength in numbers. The grief that consumed Ciri as she held her dying father in her arms transcended ordinary sorrow to encompass something approaching spiritual devastation, as the person who had been her anchor and guide throughout all of her trials breathed his last, while she remained powerless to save him despite all of the supernatural abilities that flowed through her veins. The magic that could transport her between worlds and time itself proved incapable of healing wounds that struck at the very essence of life and mortality. Yet even in this moment of ultimate despair, salvation appeared in the form of Ihuaraquax, her faithful companion whose loyalty had transcended dimensional barriers and temporal limitations to ensure that he could provide assistance when she needed it most desperately. The unicorn's horn served as a conduit for powers that exceeded even her own considerable abilities, channeling energies that operated according to principles that transcended normal, magical theory. The healing light that flowed through her hands carried within it all of the love and determination that had sustained her throughout her trials, its golden radiance capable of calling back souls that had already begun their journey toward whatever realm awaited them beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. The sight of Geralt's eyes opening once more and the sound of his voice speaking her name provided joy that exceeded anything she had previously experienced, demonstrating that even death itself could be conquered by love, sufficiently pure and determined. The boat that appeared to carry them away from the scene of so much suffering was no ordinary vessel, but rather a craft that existed partially outside normal space and time, its ability to navigate between dimensions making it the perfect means of transportation for individuals whose fates had always been intertwined with forces that operated beyond mortal understanding. The mist that surrounded them as they sailed away from the burning city served as both concealment and blessing, protecting them from pursuit while simultaneously marking their transition into realms where different rules and possibilities governed existence. The departure from their familiar world represented not defeat or exile, but rather the beginning of a new phase of existence where the bonds between them could finally develop without interference from political forces and supernatural threats that had dominated their previous experiences. The love that united this unlikely family transcended any relationship based merely upon duty or destiny, creating connections that would endure regardless of what challenges the future might bring. The mystical lake that stretched before them like a mirror of liquid starlight existed in a realm between worlds, where the boundaries that normally separated mortal existence from the eternal realms of legend and myth became permeable, as morning mist dissolving before the first rays of dawn. Here, in this place that belonged neither to the world they had known, nor to any single dimension, but rather to the spaces between all possibilities, Ciri found herself face to face with a destiny that transcended everything she had previously understood about her own nature and purpose. The figure who emerged from the crystalline waters wore the appearance of a knight whose armor gleamed with the pure radiance of morning sunlight reflected upon untarnished silver, his bearing marked by the noble grace that characterized only those whose souls had been refined by trials that tested every aspect of character and commitment. Sir Galahad of the Round Table carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had achieved perfect harmony between duty and desire, his very presence transforming the atmosphere around them from one of uncertainty into something approaching sacred tranquility. His initial assumption that Ciri must be the fabled Lady of the Lake spoke to legends that had grown around figures of power and mystery throughout countless worlds and ages, as mortal imagination sought to explain encounters with forces that operated beyond ordinary understanding through stories that rendered the impossible comprehensible. The mistake was understandable given the circumstances of their meeting, yet it also revealed the degree to which even the most enlightened individuals remained bound by the limitations of their own cultural frameworks and mythological traditions. The conversation that developed between them, as they shared simple food beside the waters that had brought them together, revealed depths of wisdom and experience that transcended the boundaries between different worlds and ages. Their exchange of stories, creating bonds of understanding that proved friendship could flourish even between beings whose origins and destinies lay in completely separate realms of existence. The knight's willingness to listen without judgment to tales that challenged his understanding of reality demonstrated the open-mindedness that had made him worthy of achieving the greatest quests known to his world. Ciri's account of her journeys through dimensions and time carried within it lessons about the nature of power and responsibility that resonated with truths that Galahad had discovered during his own pursuit of perfection and Castian enlightenment. Their shared recognition of the burdens that accompanied great abilities, creating immediate sympathy between two souls who understood the price that destiny demanded from those it chose to serve its purposes. The weight of expectations and obligations that had shaped both of their lives provided common ground despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and experiences. The realm of King Arthur that Galahad described to her was one where the ideals of chivalry and justice had been refined to their highest possible expression, creating a society that served as beacon of hope and inspiration to all who yearned for proof that mortals could transcend their baser instincts in pursuit of something truly worthy of admiration and emulation. The Round Table represented not merely a piece of furniture, but rather a symbol of equality and mutual respect that had transformed a collection of individual warriors into something approaching a sacred brotherhood. The invitation to accompany him to Camelot offered Ciri the possibility of finding refuge in a place where her abilities would be valued for their potential to serve noble purposes rather than exploited for the benefit of those whose ambitions recognized no moral constraints, while simultaneously providing her with opportunities to learn from individuals whose commitment to virtue had been tested in the crucible of genuine adversity. The prospect of walking among knights whose names had become synonymous with honor and courage held appeal that went beyond mere safety to encompass the possibility of redemption and purpose. Yet, the decision to remain in this Arthurian realm for an extended period also reflected Ciri's growing understanding that her interventions in the affairs of her original world had created complications and unintended consequences that might require time and distance to resolve properly, as the forces she had set in motion through her various actions and choices continued to work their way through the complex web of cause and effect that governed the relationships between dimensions and timelines. The wisdom of temporary withdrawal from direct involvement allowed events to develop according to their own internal logic rather than being constantly disrupted by her presence. The months that she spent in Arthur's kingdom provided her with experiences and insights that had been impossible to acquire during her years of constant crisis and upheaval, as the relative peace and stability of Camelot allowed her to observe how truly noble individuals conducted themselves when freed from the immediate pressures of survival and the temptations of absolute power. The knights whose company she kept represented the highest aspirations of human civilization, their dedication to protecting the innocent and serving the greater good, providing examples that challenged her cynicism while inspiring hope for the future of intelligent beings throughout the cosmos. The training and education that she received from these legendary figures encompassed not merely martial skills and magical techniques, but also philosophical principles and moral frameworks that had been refined through generations of thoughtful consideration and practical application. their teachings offering her tools for understanding and managing the responsibilities that came with her unique heritage and abilities. The Round Table's emphasis on service rather than domination provided a model for how power could be exercised in ways that elevated rather than corrupted those who wielded it. The relationships that she formed with various members of Arthur's court revealed the possibility of human connections based upon mutual respect and shared commitment to worthy goals, rather than the patterns of exploitation, manipulation that had characterized so many of her previous encounters with those who possessed authority or influence. The genuine affection and concern that these individuals showed for her welfare demonstrated that even in a world where political considerations necessarily played important roles, authentic friendship and loyalty could still flourish among those whose characters had been shaped by exposure to truly noble ideals. Yet even in this realm of legendary virtue and heroic achievement, Ciri could not entirely escape the shadows of her past, or the awareness that her destiny lay ultimately in realms where the clear distinctions between good and evil that characterized Arthurian romance would be replaced by the moral ambiguities and complex choices that defined existence in worlds where perfection remained an aspiration rather than an achieved reality. The knowledge that her respite in Camelot was temporary rather than permanent colored all of her experiences there with poignancy that made even moments of genuine happiness carry undertones of melancholy. The magical abilities that had been suppressed or corrupted during her years of trauma and exploitation gradually began to heal and develop in positive directions under the influence of teachers whose understanding of supernatural forces was grounded in centuries of tradition, dedicated to using such powers in service of justice and protection, rather than personal aggrandizement or the domination of others. The techniques she learned for controlling and channeling the elder blood that flowed through her veins were based upon principles of harmony and balance, rather than the violent exploitation that had characterized most of her previous magical education. The philosophical discussions that filled many of her evenings in Camelot's Great Hall introduced her to ways of thinking about questions of duty and destiny that transcended the fatalistic acceptance that had characterized much of her earlier understanding of her role in cosmic affairs. As the knights whose wisdom had been earned through years of service to ideals greater than themselves shared insights about the relationship between free will and predetermined fate that challenged her assumptions about the degree to which individuals could shape their own destinies through conscious choice and moral commitment. The gradual healing of psychological wounds that had been inflicted during her years of captivity and abuse proceeded slowly but steadily under the influence of relationships and experiences that demonstrated the possibility of trust, vulnerability without exploitation or betrayal. While the example of individuals who had faced their own trials and temptations without losing their fundamental commitment to virtue provided her with models for understanding how integrity could be maintained even under the most challenging circumstances. The stories that she heard of quests undertaken and obstacles overcome by the Knights of the Round Table revealed patterns of heroism and sacrifice that transcended individual achievement to encompass something approaching spiritual transformation, their adventures serving not merely as sources of glory or material reward, but as opportunities for the refinement of character and the deepening of commitment to principles that elevated all participants, regardless of whether their specific goals were ultimately achieved or frustrated by circumstances beyond their control. The music and poetry that filled Camelot's halls during times of celebration and reflection carried within them echoes of truths about the nature of beauty and meaning that had been largely absent from Ciri's recent homes. Experiences, their harmonies and rhythms, serving as reminders that existence could encompass joy and wonder, as well as struggle and suffering. while their themes spoke to aspirations and possibilities that remained valid despite the prevalence of corruption and cruelty in so much of the cosmos. The gradual return of her capacity for laughter and spontaneous pleasure marked important milestones in her recovery from traumas that had threatened to destroy her ability to experience positive emotions, while her growing willingness to form emotional attachments without the constant expectation of betrayal or abandonment demonstrated that even the most severe psychological damage could heal when subjected to consistent exposure to genuine kindness and respect from individuals whose commitment to virtue was absolute rather than conditional. Yet as the seasons turned and her strength and wisdom continued to develop under the tutelage of Arthur's knights, Ciri became increasingly aware that her time in this realm of legendary perfection was drawing toward its natural conclusion, as the responsibilities and connections that awaited her in other dimensions began to reassert their claims upon her attention and loyalty. The knowledge that Geralt and Yennefer continued to need her presence and support in their ongoing adventures created obligations that could not be indefinitely postponed, without betraying the love and trust that had sustained her through her darkest moments. The decision to eventually depart from Camelot was motivated not by dissatisfaction with the peace and purpose she had found there, but rather by recognition that her destiny lay ultimately in service to causes and individuals whose needs transcended even the noble ideals that had provided her with such valuable healing and education, while her understanding of the interconnected nature of all existence made it clear that her unique abilities carried with them obligations that extended across multiple dimensions and timelines. The farewell ceremonies that marked her departure from Arthur's court were both celebration and benediction, as the knights whose friendship and wisdom had contributed so significantly to her recovery gathered to offer their blessings and express their confidence in her ability to meet whatever challenges awaited her in the realms beyond their direct influence. The gifts they presented to her included not only practical items that would serve her well in her travels, but also tokens of remembrance that would carry the spiritual essence of their shared experiences into whatever future circumstances she might encounter. The portal that opened to receive her as she prepared to leave Camelot behind was different from the violent dimensional rifts that had characterized most of her previous travels between worlds. Its gentle radiance and harmonious energies, reflecting the influence of powers that operated according to principles of love and service, rather than mere mechanical force or exploitative manipulation. The transition that carried her back toward her original realm felt more like homecoming than exile, suggesting that her experiences in Arthur's kingdom had prepared her to face familiar challenges with new wisdom and renewed strength. The world that welcomed her return had been subtly but significantly changed by her absence and the various interventions she had made before her departure for the Arthurian realm, as the ripple effects of her actions and choices had worked their way through the complex web of relationships and circumstances that governed the interactions between different factions and individuals. The relative peace that had settled over many of the regions where she had once been hunted or exploited suggested that her previous efforts to establish justice and protect the innocent had achieved more lasting results than she had dared to hope. The reunion with Geralt and Yennefer that she had anticipated with such longing proved to be everything she had imagined, and more, as the bonds that connected them had been strengthened rather than weakened by their separation, while their joy at her return was matched only by their pride in the growth and development that her experiences in other realms had made possible. The stories that they shared of their own adventures during her absence revealed that they too had been changed by their experiences, their understanding of their roles and responsibilities having evolved in ways that complemented her own spiritual and intellectual development. The new phase of their relationship that began with this reunion was characterized by equality and mutual respect rather than the patterns of protection and dependence that had necessarily marked their earlier interactions. As Ciri's experiences in multiple dimensions had transformed her from someone who required guidance and shelter into a partner whose wisdom and abilities complemented rather than duplicated those of her beloved mentors and guardians. The adventures that they undertook together reflected this new dynamic, their collaboration representing the synthesis of different strengths and perspectives rather than the dominance of any single individual or approach. Yet even as they celebrated their reunion and planned for future adventures together, all three of them remained aware that their individual destinies continued to be shaped by forces that operated beyond their direct control, while their commitment to serving causes greater than themselves ensured that their paths would continue to diverge and converge according to patterns that reflected the complex needs of a cosmos, where the struggle between light and darkness, order and chaos required the dedication of champions, willing to sacrifice personal happiness for the welfare of countless others whose names they would never know. The stories that would be told of their continuing adventures would speak to the enduring power of love and loyalty to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, while transforming those who experience such bonds into something greater, the sum of their individual capabilities, their legend serving as inspiration and guidance for future generations who would face their own trials and discover within themselves the capacity for heroism that lies dormant in every soul until awakened by circumstances that demand the free, highest expressions of human potential and divine grace.